On his way to a business trip, a millionaire CEO sees a blonde boy crying at the airport and feels an immediate connection. After a conversation, he discovers the boy is his long-lost son. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Matthew Fletcher stood in Terminal C of the bustling JFK International Airport, watching as travelers hurried past with rolling suitcases and anxious expressions. He was a man accustomed to moving quickly himself, a self-made millionaire and CEO of a thriving tech firm whose name graced magazine covers and business headlines. Yet in this moment, he felt oddly still, as if the tidal currents of the airport surged around him while he remained anchored in place. The overhead speakers droned with announcements, but none of them mattered. Matthew's flight was delayed, and for once he had nothing pressing on his mind except the dull ache of exhaustion that had been following him for weeks. He was there on a business trip gone awry, a conference call canceled, an investor meeting postponed, and now he was waiting for a flight that might not depart until late evening. Sighing, he made his way to a seat near Gate 17, intent on using the unexpected downtime to organize notes for his next pitch. But as he scanned the rows of plastic chairs, his gaze snagged on a small figure huddled in the corner. A boy, maybe 8 or 9, wearing jeans that were too short at the ankles and a hoodie far too thin for the chilly autumn air. Something in the child's posture caught Matthew's attention. The boy's shoulders were trembling, and a quiet sniffle reached Matthew's ears, even over the background chatter of announcements and rolling luggage. At first, Matthew told himself to stay out of it. He had no reason to intrude on a stranger's situation, but an inexplicable pull made him abandon that impulse. Instead, he walked toward the child, noticing that the boy's sneakers were scuffed and his fingertips red from clutching them too tightly. He seemed alone, terrified, and heartbreakingly fragile. "Hey," Matthew said gently, crouching down to meet the boy's eye level. "Are you all right?" The boy looked up, his eyes wide with sorrow. There were dried tear stains on his cheeks. He blinked at Matthew, as if startled that anyone had bothered to notice him. For a moment he didn't speak, just stared with a mixture of fear and relief that someone had offered a hand. The boy began, then swallowed hard. "I lost my money for the bus and—" Matthew waited, sensing the boy's struggle to find the right words. Passengers kept streaming by, impatient for their flights, but it felt like Matthew and the boy were in a quiet pocket separate from the rest of the world. "It's okay," Matthew said softly. "We'll figure it out. Did you come here alone?" The boy shook his head, his eyes brimming with fresh tears. "I flew here from Chicago, but I don't know where my mom is. She was supposed to meet me after I got off the plane, but she's not answering her phone." Alarm bells went off in Matthew's mind. An unaccompanied minor missing his guardian was bad enough, but seeing how distressed the child looked made it worse. "What's your name?" "Jamie," the boy whispered, hugging his small backpack close to his chest. "I'm Matthew," he replied, offering a small, reassuring smile. "Jamie, do you have anyone else's number, a relative or friend?" Jamie shook his head, and a tear slipped down his cheek. "My mom always said she'd be here waiting. She told me not to talk to strangers, but I don't know where else to go." Matthew's heart twisted. He'd never considered himself especially paternal. His life revolved around deals, acquisitions, and product launches. Yet here was this child, alone and frightened in one of the world's largest airports, with no one else to turn to. It occurred to Matthew that he could walk away, pass the responsibility to airport security, but the notion felt wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. "Come on," he said quietly, standing up and offering his hand. "Let's talk to the airline staff. Maybe they have a protocol for this situation." Jamie glanced at Matthew's outstretched hand, as if it were both a lifeline and a source of uncertainty. After a hesitant moment, He slipped his small fingers into Matthew's palm. The boy's grip was cool to the touch, his hand trembling slightly in Matthew's. Together, they navigated the clamor of the terminal until they found a customer service counter. A woman in a crisp uniform listened sympathetically to Jamie's story, but informed them that the airline had no record of his mother's travel. She advised contacting the authorities if Jamie's mother didn't arrive within the hour. Matthew's phone buzzed at that moment, a reminder for a postponed meeting. He glanced at the screen, then at Jamie. "We'll wait," he told the employee, who nodded. Then he steered Jamie to a quieter corner, near a row of small coffee shops. They sat at a table opposite a large window overlooking the runway. Jet engines roared and streaks of sunlight danced across polished floors. Jamie sipped a hot chocolate Matthew had purchased for him, clasping the cup with both hands as if it were a precious treasure. Time passed in slow, tense increments. Matthew called the number Jamie provided, his mother's cell phone, several times, but it always went straight to voicemail. Each failed attempt seemed to chip away at the boy's composure. His eyes would flick to Matthew with growing dread, and though Matthew tried to reassure him, he had no real comfort to offer. An hour stretched into 2. The possibility that Jamie's mother had simply abandoned him nudged its way into Matthew's thoughts, but he refused to voice it. Instead, he promised Jamie they'd find a solution. He tried to glean more information, Jamie's last name, details about his home, anything that might help. "Parkinson," the boy said, his voice wavering when Matthew asked for his full name. "Jamie Parkinson. And your mother's name?" "Stella Parkinson." Matthew tried searching online for the name, scanning social media, but without success. By now, the shadows in the terminal were growing longer, and the once frenetic pace of passengers had mellowed into a steady trickle. Late afternoon flights were departing, others were delayed. The hours were slipping by with no word from Stella. Eventually, a man in a Transportation Security Administration uniform approached, alerted by the airline staff. He spoke to Jamie kindly, asking if he wanted them to help file a missing persons report. But Jamie's eyes flicked to Matthew, and he shook his head adamantly. "You can trust them," Matthew said, placing a reassuring hand on Jamie's shoulder. Jamie didn't answer right away. His lip quivered, as if he was on the edge of a breakdown. "I want to call my grandpa," he finally whispered. "He lives in California, but I don't have his number." Matthew looked at the TSA officer, who nodded gravely, saying they would try to find the contact through official channels. Yet every attempt seemed to hit a wall. Stella's phone remained off, and the airline could only confirm that Jamie had traveled alone from Chicago on a ticket purchased with cash. No father's name appeared on any form. Matthew's gut churned. He couldn't leave this child to the cold mercy of a system that might shuffle him around indefinitely, so he did something he never imagined himself doing. He offered to let Jamie stay with him at a nearby airport hotel until they figured out the next step. The TSA officer and airline employees were visibly relieved that someone with resources was stepping in. Official forms were filled out, disclaimers signed to note that Jamie was in the temporary care of a private citizen. It all felt surreal, but Matthew pressed forward, ignoring the quiet voice in his mind, warning him how complicated this could get. They reached the hotel, a sleek business-class establishment connected to the terminal by a glass corridor. Jamie clutched his backpack, staring wide-eyed at the polished lobby floors and modern chandeliers. It seemed too grand a place for such a young boy burdened with so much worry. Up in the room, Matthew showed Jamie around. 2 beds, a small desk, and a panoramic window overlooking the runway. The boy offered a small smile, but Matthew could sense fear overshadowing any excitement. He ordered dinner from room service, a simple plate of pasta for Jamie, a salad for himself. As they ate, A fragile sort of calm settled, though the question of Stella's whereabouts loomed over them. That was when Jamie pulled a crumpled photograph from his backpack. He smoothed it on the table, revealing a younger Stella Parkinson cradling a baby. She was smiling, her features delicate. But what riveted Matthew was the undeniable hint of recognition tugging at the edges of his memory. He couldn't quite place it, but something about the woman's eyes was almost haunting. "This was us," Jamie said quietly, pointing to the baby in the photo. "Mom always said I looked just like my dad, but she never told me who he was." Matthew felt a sudden jolt, as if a missing puzzle piece had slid into place. He studied Stella's face, realizing he'd seen it before long ago in Chicago at a corporate event. She had been with an acquaintance, one of Matthew's earliest mentors perhaps. The details were fuzzy, but there was an echo of recognition that refused to let go. "Jamie," Matthew said slowly, feeling his pulse thrumming. "How old are you now?" "8, Jamie replied. Matthew did some quick mental math, his heart pounding faster at each tick. He thought of the times he'd visited Chicago for expansions, startups, an entire phase of his life spent traveling in and out of the city. Memories collided in a dizzying swirl. Could it be possible that Stella was someone from his past, someone he'd once shared a fleeting connection with? Unease coiled in his gut, and he forced himself to remain calm. The notion seemed ludicrous. Yet the timing, Stella's photograph, and that inexplicable sense of déjà vu refused to be ignored. He stared into Jamie's face, noticing for the first time the shape of his jaw, the faint arch of his brows. They were familiar. A wave of fear and hope and confusion washed over him. If what he was suspecting was true, then the boy sitting before him, scared, exhausted, clutching a photograph, was not just a child in need. He might well be Matthew's own son. Before going any further, please remember to like, share, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story. Matthew's pulse thrummed in his ears as he sat across from Jamie in the sterile quiet of that hotel room. The photograph of Stella felt like a fragment from a half-remembered dream, and the more he stared at it, the more it tugged at the hidden corners of his memory. He recalled a small gathering after one of his earliest product launches in Chicago almost a decade ago. How he'd clinked glasses in celebration with an old business mentor named Gary Allison, who had introduced him to a friend. Or was it a colleague? He couldn't recall the specifics. But now, that vague recollection was pressing insistently against his thoughts, demanding he acknowledge the possibility that he and Stella had crossed paths under circumstances he'd never bothered to revisit. He couldn't claim he remembered any affair or romance. Everything from that frenetic period in his life had been overshadowed by his ambition. Yet something about Stella's eyes in that photograph made him feel as if he'd once known her far more intimately than he realized. He was acutely aware of Jamie's presence, the boy's slender shoulders tense as he waited for some reassurance. Matthew set the photograph gently on the table. "Jamie," he said softly, meeting the boy's wary gaze. "Can you tell me more about your mom? Anything that might help us figure out where she is right now?" Jamie swallowed, momentarily distracted by the swirl of leftover pasta on his plate. She's a waitress. She used to work nights. We moved around a lot, never stayed in one place for very long." He paused, eyes flicking to the photograph. "Sometimes she'd say we were going to have a fresh start, that life was about to get better, but it never really did. She was always tired, always worrying." Matthew nodded, trying to fit the pieces together. He wondered if Stella had any family in Chicago aside from whomever Jamie's grandfather might be in California. If she was in trouble, perhaps she had left the city in a hurry, hoping to reconnect with someone else. But why would she tell Jamie to fly alone and then not show up at the airport? Jamie seemed to sense Matthew's growing concern. "We were supposed to meet here," he said, voice trembling. "Mom told me to trust her. She said we'd figure out how to get to Grandpa after we landed. But she never came." Matthew felt a surge of anger at Stella, though it was tempered by compassion. How desperate did a person have to be to send a child unaccompanied, trusting that a plan would magically come together on the other end? He forced the emotion aside, focusing on the immediate problem. Jamie needed stability, a safe place to stay. Leaning forward, he reached across the table to squeeze the boy's small hand. "We'll keep trying to call her," Matthew promised. "And tomorrow, I'll do what I can to track down this grandfather in California. Someone has to know how to contact him." Jamie gave him a tentative nod, hope and anxiety mingling in his eyes. "Okay." Night pressed in, each passing hour making the spacious hotel room feel oddly claustrophobic. After dinner, Jamie excused himself to shower. Matthew used the time to make a series of phone calls to an old friend at a private investigations firm, to a tech-savvy colleague who might help trace Stella's digital footprint, and to the airline again, just in case new information had surfaced. But every lead hit a dead end. Stella's phone remained off, and no one at the Chicago address listed for her seemed to know anything. The final call was to his own personal assistant, Kelly, who sounded groggy when she picked up. Matthew didn't care that it was late. This was urgent. "I need you to do some digging," he said, pacing the small stretch of carpet near the window. "Her name is Stella Parkinson. She might also go by Stella Diaz. Jamie said something about her using different last names. See if you can find a work history, addresses, anything." Kelly agreed, though Matthew could hear the apprehension in her voice. "You sure about taking on this responsibility?" she asked gently. "You barely know the boy. What if there's more to this situation?" Matthew glanced toward the closed bathroom door, where faint sounds of water echoed. "I don't have a choice," he muttered. "He's here, alone. I can't just walk away." When Jamie emerged from the shower, dressed in pajamas far too thin for the chilly hotel air, Matthew handed him a spare sweatshirt. It nearly swallowed the boy's slight frame, but Jamie wore it gratefully. They settled onto their separate beds, the overhead light casting soft halos on the walls. Jamie clutched his photograph of Stella, eyes distant. "Hey," Matthew said gently, "I know this is scary, but I want you to know something. No matter what happens, I'll make sure you're safe." Jamie nodded, sliding beneath the covers. Matthew could see the tension in the boy's jaw, the worry that no promise was strong enough to erase. Eventually, exhaustion claimed them both. Morning arrived with a relentless glare of sunlight through the wide windows. Matthew checked his phone and found a string of messages from Kelly, who had worked through the night. Most were dead ends, but there was one thread, a mention that Stella might have once lived in a suburb outside Chicago, renting a room from a woman named Carla Hughes. Carla's phone number was attached, so Matthew promptly dialed it. After several rings, a tired voice answered, and Matthew introduced himself. When he explained that he was looking for Stella, the woman took a skeptical tone. "She left months ago," Carla said. "Ran off in the middle of the night. Owed me rent. I heard from her once after that. She said she had a line on a better job in New York. That's all I know." His frustration mounted. "She didn't mention a son?" "Yeah," Carla sighed. "I always felt sorry for that kid. He was quiet, polite. She never acted like she hated him or anything, but it was like she wasn't ready for motherhood. Always seemed in over her head." Matthew thanked Carla and ended the call with more questions than answers. He didn't want to judge Stella too harshly. People found themselves in desperate situations all the time. Yet the uneasy truth was that Stella's actions had left Jamie stranded. He turned to see Jamie awake, sitting cross-legged on his bed. "Any luck?" the boy asked, voice subdued. Not yet, Matthew admitted, but I'm not giving up. Jamie's gaze flicked to the clock on the nightstand, and Matthew realized the child was probably wondering how long he'd be forced to rely on a stranger's kindness. For a moment, Matthew considered the day ahead. His flight was rescheduled for late afternoon, but now he doubted he'd take it. He had responsibilities back home, but how could he abandon Jamie? The same question that had plagued him the night before returned. Could this child be his own son? "Jamie," Matthew said carefully, motioning for the boy to join him by the small table. "I need to ask you a few things about when you were born. Do you know anything about your father, even if it's something small, an initial, a story your mom might have told?" Jamie squirmed, looking torn. She never said much, just that he was someone who didn't stick around. She told me I shouldn't hate him because maybe he didn't know about me. But I always figured he just didn't want me. A pang of guilt and empathy cut through Matthew. He thought of how easy it would be for a young woman to slip out of his life during that frenzied climb toward corporate success all those years ago. Could he truly have fathered a child and never known it? His phone vibrated with a call from his private investigator friend, Jim Larkin. The conversation was short but informative. Jim had found a few leads, possible acquaintances of Stella in the city. "I'll keep digging," Jim said. "But if this is time-sensitive, you might want to consider an alternative approach, like filing a missing person report or involving social services. That might cause trouble if Stella reappears, though." Matthew ended the call and glanced at Jamie, who stared back with hollow eyes. Filing official paperwork might turn the boy's life upside down, and Matthew suspected Stella had avoided public systems for fear of losing custody or being forced into a corner. One misstep might bury her in legal or financial problems. Yet the more he weighed the options, the clearer it became that doing nothing was worse. "Jamie," he said, choosing his words with care, "I think we need to go to the police. Not because you did anything wrong, but because they might help us find your mom faster. It'll be okay, I'll be with you." The boy inhaled sharply, gripping the photograph so tightly it crinkled at the edges. "You promise you won't leave me?" he asked, voice quivering with an undercurrent of desperation. Matthew reached out, resting a hand on Jamie's shoulder. "I promise. Whatever happens, I'm not leaving you to handle this by yourself." They hailed a cab to the local precinct, the ride filled with tense silence. Outside, the city vibrated with morning hustle. Business people checking emails, tourists snapping photos, cabs weaving through traffic. Jamie stared at the passing buildings, shoulders hunched, expression wary. Matthew found himself determined to shield this child from any more uncertainty. The closer they got to the precinct, the more firmly Matthew resolved that even if Stella turned up safe and sound, he needed concrete answers about Jamie's paternity. If there was any chance that he was the father, he owed it to the boy to take responsibility. A police officer at the desk took down their information, nodding sympathetically but warning them that locating a missing adult could be complicated. There was no guarantee Stella was officially missing at all. "Sometimes people just walk away from their lives," the officer said. "We'll enter her information, but if she has no warrants or immediate flags, we can't force her to come forward." Jamie's face fell. Matthew, jaw tight, pushed down his frustration and gave the officer Stella's details, hoping that something would show up in the system. When the formalities were done, the officer thanked them, adding that if Stella turned up or if they learned anything else, to call immediately. On the way out, the hush between them felt heavier. They had accomplished one step, yet it brought no tangible relief. Jamie glanced at Matthew as they exited the station. "What now?" Matthew set a steady hand against the boy's back, guiding him along the sidewalk. "We'll go to my place," he said, making a decision in that moment. "You can't stay in a hotel forever, and we need a place to figure out our next moves." I have a house in Westchester, it's not far. Jamie made no objection, though he looked overwhelmed. Is it just you, or? Just me, Matthew confirmed, swallowing a sudden lump in his throat. I never married, no kids. He paused before forcing out a quiet addendum. At least I didn't think I had any. He watched the meaning of those words settle on Jamie's face. The boy didn't say anything, but the flicker of emotion in his eyes spoke volumes. They both understood the enormity of that admission. If Matthew's suspicions were correct, their lives were about to become even more entwined. They took another taxi back to the hotel, gathered Jamie's few belongings, and checked out. As they climbed into Matthew's sedan and left the city behind, neither spoke much. The busy Manhattan streets gradually gave way to the quieter, tree-lined roads of Westchester County, the leaves showing hints of late-season color. The route felt strangely symbolic, as if each mile carried them further from the chaos of the airport and deeper into an unknown future. When they finally arrived, Matthew noticed Jamie's wide-eyed look of surprise at the stone driveway and the imposing modern lines of the house. It was both luxurious and austere, designed to reflect Matthew's preference for minimalism and efficiency. He realized how alien it must seem to a child who had never stayed anywhere long. "Make yourself at home," Matthew said as he parked, offering a small smile that he hoped would ease the boy's apprehension. Jamie nodded, though awe and uncertainty still shadowed his features. Inside, Matthew showed him around. The spacious living room with tall windows that looked out over a well-kept garden, a sleek kitchen stocked mostly with prepackaged meals, and a guest bedroom with a neatly made bed. "This will be your room for now," Matthew said, flicking on the light. "There's a bathroom across the hall. Anything you need, just tell me." Jamie's eyes roamed the space, a hint of longing in the set of his shoulders, as if he dared not believe this could be a place he might belong. "Thank you," he mumbled. "I don't want to be a burden." "You're not," Matthew said firmly, stepping closer. "Don't ever think that." The boy nodded, then lowered his gaze. A rush of protectiveness surged through Matthew. He had never anticipated caring for a child, especially not one who appeared out of nowhere in an airport. But he couldn't deny how right it felt to offer Jamie a safe haven. And beneath it all, a question still pulsed in his mind with insistent urgency. Was Jamie truly his son? Before going any further, please remember to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with friends. Matthew awoke the next morning to find sunlight pouring through the tall windows in his Westchester home. He dressed quickly and stepped into the hallway, reminded that this space felt different now that someone else was inside its walls. He peeked into the guest bedroom, heart constricting when he saw Jamie still asleep, his small frame curled up beneath the covers. The boy looked peaceful, yet Matthew knew the day ahead would be tense. He'd spent half the night wrestling with the idea of a DNA test, aware that the result could redefine everything. If it confirmed Jamie was his son, excitement and fear would collide. If it showed otherwise, he had no idea how they'd handle the disappointment. He quietly shut the door and headed downstairs. The morning air felt crisp through an open kitchen window, but he barely touched his coffee. His mind spun with phone calls and the fear that no update on Stella's whereabouts might surface. Checking his phone, he found fresh messages from Kelly. One offered a possible Westchester address linked to Stella under another alias. Matthew's pulse quickened. It might be old news, yet it was a lead. Maybe Stella was hiding or caught in some desperate spiral. He wanted answers for Jamie's sake, but each clue felt more unsettling than the last. Footsteps creaked on the stairs behind him. He turned to see Jamie, hair tousled, wearing the oversized sweatshirt from yesterday. "Morning," Matthew said gently. Jamie offered a faint smile before sitting at the kitchen island. "You sleep okay?" Matthew asked. A shrug. The boy's eyes were rimmed with exhaustion. "We'll have breakfast," Matthew continued, "then check if there's any new info. Kelly found an address that might lead us to your mom." Jamie nodded, looking more anxious than hopeful. He glanced around the sleek countertops. "Your house is huge," he murmured. Matthew tried a small smile. "You'll get used to it." He grabbed eggs and milk, opting for scrambled eggs. While they cooked, Jamie sat quietly, occasionally glancing at Matthew as if unsure how to act. A memory of Matthew's own childhood surfaced, how his mother used to hum while she worked. Now he wondered if Jamie had any moments like that, or if survival had overshadowed such comforts. Once the eggs were done, Matthew handed the boy a plate. They ate in silence, the clock ticking loudly. At last, Matthew spoke. "I've been thinking about a DNA test, only if you're okay with it. I need to know." Jamie froze, fork poised midair. "You think maybe?" he whispered. Matthew braced himself. "Yes. I was in Chicago around when you were born. It's possible." Jamie set his fork down, expression torn between hope and fear. "What if you are my dad?" he managed, voice quavering. Matthew inhaled. "Then I want to be in your life, make up for lost time however I can." Jamie's breath caught. "And if you're not?" Matthew felt a pang in his chest. "I'm not leaving you. We'll figure it out." The boy stared at his plate, tears threatening to spill. Matthew reached across the table to gently squeeze his arm. A fragile understanding passed between them. In that moment, Matthew recognized how much this child needed someone to stay, no matter what the test might reveal. They wrapped up breakfast quietly. Soon, Jamie headed off to shower and change into the new clothes they'd bought. Meanwhile, Matthew booked a same-day paternity test at a discreet clinic, each step feeling both too fast and not fast enough. He also called Kelly about that Westchester address tied to Stella, arranging to stop by after the clinic. The weight of uncertainty gnawed at him, but he reminded himself that clarity would come. If Stella was there, maybe she had answers. Maybe she was in trouble. All Matthew knew was that for Jamie's sake, he had to push forward and hope the outcome wouldn't shatter them both. By late morning, Matthew and Jamie drove to the clinic, neither speaking much. The building was plain, a low-key medical suite that promised confidentiality. A nurse swabbed the inside of both their cheeks, businesslike and silent. Jamie sat stiffly in the waiting area, clutching that precious photograph. For Matthew, the procedure felt monumental. If the results said yes, he'd have an unexpected son relying on him. If no, he still couldn't dismiss Jamie's needs. On leaving, he paid extra for rush processing. Once outside, the midday sun felt uncomfortably bright. Jamie blinked at Matthew, and Matthew forced a reassuring nod. "We'll know soon," he murmured. Jamie clutched the car door handle. "And then?" Matthew pressed his lips together. "Then we face whatever's next." The drive to Westchester's outskirts was hushed, each of them lost in private worries. Kelly had texted an address, a small single-story home with peeling paint and a ragged lawn. When they arrived, Matthew parked along the curb, heart pounding at the sight of a battered sedan in the driveway. The place looked neglected, blinds drawn against the midday sun. Jamie's breathing quickened. "Do you really think she's in there?" he asked, voice quivering. Matthew hesitated. "Only one way to find out." Together they approached the front door. No sounds came from inside, but the faint odor of stale cigarettes drifted from a half-open window. Matthew raised his hand to knock, only to notice the door was slightly ajar. He glanced at Jamie, who was clutching his photograph in trembling hands. Carefully, Matthew pushed the door open, revealing a dim and musty living room strewn with magazines and crumpled fast food bags. The stale, smoky air caught in his throat, tension coiling in his chest. "Hello?" he called, voice echoing in the silence. No answer came. The entire place felt frozen in time. Sticky footprints stained the dingy tile, and half-eaten food lay abandoned on a table. Fear flickered across Jamie's face as he edged behind Matthew, eyes darting to each doorway. "Mom?" he called softly, his voice tremulous. The silence pressed in. Finally, they ventured deeper, past a cluttered kitchen into a narrow hallway. Several doors branched off. One led to a bedroom with a sagging mattress, blankets tossed haphazardly. Another revealed a cramped bathroom with a flickering light. A third door stood closed at the end of the narrow hall, the doorknob chipped. Heart racing, Matthew eased it open. Inside, the curtains were drawn. On a desk sat a stack of papers bearing Stella's name. The bed was empty, the sheets undone, as if someone slept there recently. Jamie stepped forward, hope in his gaze. "She was here," he breathed, running a hand over the scattered belongings. Matthew nodded, tension thrumming. "Yeah, not long ago by the look of it." Matthew scanned the loose papers on the desk. Most were unpaid bills, eviction notices, or scribbled notes hinting at money troubles. One page bore Stella's handwriting, random phone numbers, half of them crossed out. He found no mention of flights, no obvious clue about her current location. Jamie hovered, gaze bouncing around the messy room. "Why would she leave again?" he muttered, frustration creeping into his tone. Matthew inhaled. "Maybe something scared her, or she's running from someone." A chill rippled through him at that prospect. Maybe she felt cornered and fled. Could Stella be fleeing a threat, an abusive ex, debt collectors, or something else entirely? He placed the papers back, mindful of Jamie's unsettled expression. "We'll show these to the police," he decided. "It might help." Jamie nodded, eyes brimming with worry. He lifted a worn sweater from the floor, inhaling as though hoping to catch a trace of his mother's presence. The gesture made Matthew's chest ache. "Come on," he murmured, gently guiding Jamie out. "Let's figure our next move." Outside, the midday glare stung their eyes. Matthew guided Jamie back to the car. Although Stella was absent, her presence lingered. Jamie slid into the passenger seat, clutching the worn sweater. "What if she's hurt?" he whispered. Matthew wished he had an answer that didn't ring hollow. "We'll talk to the police again," he assured the boy. "Show them the bills, see if they can trace her whereabouts." He started the engine, his mind racing with phone calls to make. They awaited the paternity test results, and each hour felt longer than the last. But as he pulled away from that bleak house, Matthew felt a surge of determination. He wouldn't abandon Jamie to drift in a world of dead ends. Whether or not Jamie was his son, he would do all it took to bring Stella home safely. Please remember to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with friends. Matthew drove away from the small, neglected house, feeling the weight of Stella's absence pressing against his chest. Jamie sat quietly beside him, clutching his mother's worn sweater as though it were the only real link he had left to her. The boy kept his gaze fixed on the side window, where suburban homes and clusters of trees flickered by like half-formed ghosts. Neither of them spoke, and the silence felt far heavier than any words could have been. When they reached Matthew's Westchester home, he gently prodded Jamie out of the car, guiding him inside. The late afternoon light streaked through the windows, illuminating the sleek floors and modern furniture. Normally, Matthew found comfort in the quiet elegance of his space, but now it only reminded him of how alien it must seem to a child who'd grown up in cramped apartments and temporary shelters. Jamie sank onto the living room couch, still clutching Stella's sweater. Matthew settled beside him, trying to figure out the right thing to say. For several moments, the only sound was the low hum of the air conditioning. Then Matthew cleared his throat, his voice gentle. "I'm sorry we didn't find her there, but we're not done searching. That house might give us clues, or the police might learn something once we turn in those papers." Jamie nodded, fingers plucking at a loose thread on the sweater's sleeve. "I know," he whispered, though his tone was thick with defeat. I just hoped she'd be waiting for us." Matthew felt a pang of guilt. He too had imagined some cinematic reunion, a tearful Stella apologizing for leaving Jamie stranded, explaining her troubles. Instead, they had found only a mess of debts, a house in disarray, and a deafening silence. "I'll go through the documents we picked up," Matthew said. "There might be numbers to call or addresses to check." The mention of phone calls jolted Matthew's memory. The paternity test results would be coming soon, possibly by the end of the day. He glanced at Jamie, weighing the impact of that potential truth against the current chaos. "And about the test," he began, voice trailing off. Jamie's grip on the sweater tightened. "I'm scared," he admitted. "Part of me wants you to be my dad because you've been so nice. But part of me worries it's all a mistake and then you'll feel like you have no reason to keep me around." "Hey." Matthew tried to keep his tone firm, yet comforting. "I'm not going to abandon you, no matter what those results say. I've told you that before, and I mean it." Jamie nodded, though the flicker of doubt remained in his eyes. Outside, the sun was dipping toward the horizon, and the living room filled with a warm, amber light. Matthew rose, gave Jamie's shoulder a reassuring squeeze, and headed to his study to make good on his promise to comb through the papers. His study was a spacious room lined with shelves of business books and binders from old ventures. He set the stack of Stella's scattered notes on the mahogany desk, flipping through them methodically. Unpaid utility bills, credit card statements, scrawled phone numbers. It all painted a picture of desperation, but none of it revealed her current whereabouts. The further he dug, the heavier his heart grew. It was as if she had been cornered by financial woes, maybe forced into hiding by creditors or worse. Half an hour passed before he found something interesting. A folded scrap of paper with directions to a motel in New Jersey. No name, just a scribbled address along with a few numbers. It might be a dead end, but in a situation like this, any lead was worth following. He jotted it down, intending to check it out if everything else failed. By the time he emerged from the study, he found Jamie still perched on the couch, hugging Stella's sweater. The boy's anxious gaze traveled to Matthew's face. "Any luck?" "Not sure yet," Matthew admitted. "There's an address for a motel in New Jersey, but it could mean nothing. Still, we might go see if anyone there knows anything about your mom." Jamie sighed and tucked his knees to his chest. "I wish she'd just call." Matthew's phone buzzed then, as if on cue. He scrambled to pick it up, adrenaline spiking. The screen displayed the clinic's number. Jamie bolted upright, eyes wide. Though neither spoke, they both knew what this call meant. With a steadiness he didn't truly feel, Matthew accepted the call, pressing the phone to his ear. The voice on the other end was calm and professional. The paternity test results were in. Matthew's heart hammered as the person explained the data and then delivered the verdict. His breath caught. The tension in his chest eased, then returned in a different way. When the call ended, he found Jamie staring at him, fear battling hope in his features. "Well," Jamie whispered. Matthew set the phone on the coffee table, his hand still trembling. "It's positive," he said softly, almost disbelieving his own words. "Jamie, I'm your father." For an instant, time seemed to stop. Jamie's face crumpled with an emotion so overwhelming that Matthew wasn't sure if the boy was about to cry or burst into laughter. Eventually, Jamie let out a ragged breath. "You really are?" he asked, voice barely audible. Matthew nodded, crossing the small distance to sit next to him. "I am." Jamie's eyes shone with tears, and without warning, he threw his arms around Matthew in a tight hug. The gesture was so raw and desperate that Matthew felt his own eyes sting. He wrapped his arms around his son, holding him close, marveling at the surreal, beautiful fragility of this moment. He'd come to the airport on a routine trip, never imagining he'd leave with a child, let alone discover that the child was his own flesh and blood. When they finally pulled apart, Jamie's cheeks were damp, but his gaze was brighter. "Are you mad at my mom?" he blurted, voice trembling slightly. Matthew exhaled. "I'm not sure what I feel yet," he admitted. "I want to understand why she never told me, but right now, I just want to make sure you're all right and that we find her." Jamie nodded, absorbing this. For a while they sat in silence, the gravity of the new bond pulsing between them. Whatever else happened, Matthew wasn't just helping Jamie out of compassion or duty. He was a father who'd missed almost a decade of his child's life. The sheer enormity of that loss weighed heavily on him. Eventually, the quiet was disrupted by the ringing of Matthew's phone again. He glanced at the screen, noticing it was a police detective he'd spoken to earlier about Stella. Jamie tensed, his body going rigid at the possibility of real news. "Hello?" Matthew answered, pressing the phone to his ear. "Mr. Fletcher, this is Detective Ramos," came the response, voice smooth but tinged with concern. "We've been following up on the items you gave us. We're not certain, but we might have a lead. Someone matching Stella's description was seen at a bus station on the Upper West Side. We're trying to track her route." Matthew steadied himself. "Do you think she's still there?" "Unclear. Could be that she boarded a bus out of the city. We've got an officer checking security footage. We'll let you know if we confirm anything." He thanked the detective and ended the call. Jamie, whose posture spoke volumes, stared at him anxiously. "They might have found her," Matthew recounted the detective's words. "We'll see. They're checking footage. If she took a bus, she might be headed anywhere." An uncertain mixture of relief and renewed worry flickered across Jamie's face. He was silent for a moment, then asked in a small voice, "If she comes back, what happens to me? Where do I live?" Matthew inhaled, reaching for Jamie's hand again. "No matter where she is, you stay with me unless you decide otherwise. We're family now, and once we find her, we'll figure things out together." Jamie nodded, though the tension in his shoulders didn't ease. Matthew understood. The boy had spent his entire life in flux. Just because he'd discovered a father didn't mean he'd trust that father wouldn't vanish or yield to Stella's wishes. "I won't let you down," Matthew said firmly. "We'll look after her and we'll look after each other, okay?" Jamie gave the tiniest nod, blinking hard. "Okay." They spent the next few hours trying to distract themselves. Matthew set Jamie up in the guest room with a new tablet, letting him browse games and shows he might like, while Matthew returned to his study to field calls and coordinate with Detective Ramos. He sent emails to Kelly, instructing her to check bus routes and rumored sightings of Stella. The entire time, he wrestled with a surge of paternal protectiveness he'd never experienced before. It was astonishing how quickly that bond could form now that he knew Jamie was truly his son. Near dinner time, the doorbell rang. Startled, Matthew headed down the hall, motioning for Jamie to stay back. When he opened the door, he found Detective Ramos on the stoop, a tall figure with a polite but serious expression. "Mr. Fletcher?" the detective asked. Matthew nodded. "Any news?" Ramos cleared his throat. "We believe Stella boarded a Greyhound bus to Philadelphia. Witnesses say she was traveling alone, seemed anxious. We've got her face on record. But as of now, we don't know her final destination or why she left. The bus company's logs might give us some clue. We'll keep you informed." Matthew felt a swirl of relief and frustration. Stella was at least alive, but she was also fleeing. "Thank you, Detective," he said quietly. "Please let me know if you learn more." Ramos nodded, then gave him a steady look. "Is the boy all right?" Matthew glanced over his shoulder, aware that Jamie was likely listening. "He's safe with me," he confirmed. "I'm his father. We found that out today." The detective's expression softened and he offered a brief nod. "In that case, we'll do our best to resolve this. If Stella is found, we'll put you in contact." With that, the detective left. Matthew closed the door, heart heavy with the realization that Stella might keep running if she feared consequences. He turned to see Jamie standing in the hallway, arms folded tight over his chest. "She's on a bus?" the boy asked. Matthew sighed. "Looks like it." Jamie stared at the floor. "Is she running from me?" The raw hurt in his voice twisted Matthew's stomach. He moved closer, laying a hand on Jamie's shoulder. "I don't know, but I doubt it's you she's running from. Maybe she's scared or in trouble. We can't be sure until we talk to her. But I promise we'll do everything to find her." Jamie nodded, swallowing hard. For a moment he looked every bit the lost child Matthew had first encountered in that airport. But now there was also a glimmer of resilience in his gaze, as though knowing he wasn't alone helped hold him together. They spent the rest of the evening quietly. Matthew prepared a simple meal, and Jamie ate without his earlier anxiety about whether he was an unwanted guest. The dynamic between them was still tentative and new, but it no longer felt so guarded. After dinner, they watched a sitcom on Matthew's oversized television, each laughing at parts that probably weren't funny, just grateful for some semblance of normalcy. Eventually, Matthew nudged Jamie toward bed. The boy trudged upstairs, pausing at the door of the guest room. "Night," he whispered. "Thanks for everything." Matthew's chest constricted with a confusing blend of pride and sorrow. "Night, son," he replied, testing the word. It felt right, anchoring them both to this fragile new reality. When Jamie disappeared behind the door, Matthew let out a slow breath. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. More leads on Stella, new complications, or just the ongoing uncertainty. But he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't facing it alone anymore. He was a father. A role he hadn't expected yet found himself embracing with fierce determination. Before going any further, please remember to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with friends. Morning light streamed across the guest bedroom's pale blue walls, rousing Matthew from a restless sleep. Despite the previous day's upheavals, he felt a faint stir of optimism. He was no longer merely taking care of a frightened child he'd found at an airport. He was looking out for his own son. That word, father, still sat strangely on his tongue, filling him with both excitement and a deeper fear of letting Jamie down. Yet the connection between them had begun to feel natural in a startlingly short time, as though they had been waiting for one another all along. He dressed quickly and headed downstairs, where he found Jamie curled up on the couch. The television was off, but the boy stared at the blank screen. When Matthew entered, Jamie turned with a tight smile. "Couldn't sleep," he admitted, hugging his knees, his hair stuck up in uneven tufts, making him look both fragile and endearing. "It's been a lot to process," Matthew said quietly, settling next to him. "Did you at least rest a little?" Jamie shrugged. "Some, but my mind won't stop thinking about Mom. What if she's hurt or scared?" Matthew draped an arm around his son's shoulders. "We're going to figure it out. The police are following leads. Once they trace her bus route, maybe we'll learn more." A flicker of hope lit Jamie's features, but uncertainty soon dimmed it. "I know," he whispered. "I just feel guilty, like maybe I did something wrong." Matthew's heart twisted. He remembered how, as a child, he'd sometimes blamed himself for problems he didn't cause. "You didn't do anything," he said firmly. "She's the adult. It's her responsibility to look after you. And now that we know you're my son, that responsibility is mine too. You have nothing to feel guilty about." Jamie let out a shaky breath. "Thanks," he murmured, leaning into Matthew's side for a moment. They lingered in that quiet companionship until a soft rumble from Jamie's stomach broke the silence. With a half smile, Matthew stood. "Breakfast?" Jamie nodded, and they moved into the kitchen. Though Jamie was still subdued, he seemed a little calmer once they fell into a routine. Matthew scrambled eggs and toasted bread, feeling oddly grateful for the simple domestic task. They ate in near silence, the weight of the day's unknowns casting a hush over them. After cleaning up, Matthew reached for his phone. "I'm going to call Detective Ramos," he told Jamie. "See if there are any updates. Then maybe we can drive into the city ourselves just to feel like we're doing something." Jamie nodded, brightening slightly at the idea of actively searching. As Matthew stepped away to make the call, he heard the detective's phone ring 4 times before Ramos picked up. The detective's voice was clipped but not unfriendly. "No new sightings," Ramos reported. "We've been in contact with Philadelphia law enforcement, but she hasn't turned up. We're checking bus transfers. She could be headed anywhere. Washington, Baltimore, maybe somewhere more distant if she had cash for another ticket." Matthew felt a pang of frustration. "All right," he said. "Any suggestions on how I can help?" "Keep me updated on any tips you get. If you hear from her, call us. Other than that, it's a waiting game." Matthew ended the call with a sigh. When he returned to the kitchen, Jamie's face fell at the sight of Matthew's strained expression. "So, no news?" the boy asked softly. "No," Matthew admitted. "We might still try to retrace her steps, visit the bus station, see if anyone remembers her." Jamie squared his shoulders. "I want to help." Matthew nodded. "Then let's do it. We'll head out in an hour." They prepared quickly. Jamie slipped on jeans and a hoodie, while Matthew threw on a jacket and gathered the address he'd found pointing to a motel in New Jersey. If time allowed, they could drive there in the afternoon. The plan was loose, but having a plan at all seemed to buoy Jamie's spirits. Not long after they were in Matthew's car, the greenery of Westchester giving way to urban congestion as they neared Manhattan. Traffic thickened, cabs wove between lanes, and towering buildings loomed. Jamie stared out the window, his expression pinched with a mix of apprehension and curiosity. Matthew recalled his own early visits to the city, how everything had seemed larger than life, a place where ambition could spark and spread like wildfire. Now, though, his own ambitions had taken a back seat to a more pressing need, giving his son a future that wasn't built on fear and uncertainty. They reached the bus station and parked in a nearby garage. Rows of bus terminals stretched out behind tall glass doors, and inside the main building, a crush of travelers hurried past ticket counters and vending machines. Despite the commotion, Jamie stuck close to Matthew, gaze darting nervously around. "Where do we start?" Jamie asked, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Ticket booths," Matthew replied. "We'll ask if they remember Stella." The first few employees they spoke to offered polite shrugs. Some flipped through receipts or checked electronic logs, but nothing definitive surfaced. Discouraged, they moved deeper into the station. Eventually, they approached a middle-aged woman wiping down a snack counter. She looked up when Matthew gently said, "Excuse me, ma'am. We're looking for someone who might have been through here recently." The woman's brow furrowed as he held out Stella's photo on his phone, a cropped image Matthew had managed to find in the papers recovered from the Westchester house. Jamie hovered by his side, wearing a hopeful expression. The woman studied the screen. "I might have seen her," she said slowly, "but not sure. We get so many faces every day. If she had a ticket, maybe the staff at Gate 12 would know." Matthew thanked her, letting out a quiet sigh. They made their way toward Gate 12, stepping around luggage and weaving through lines of weary travelers. A bored-looking attendant was scanning tickets for a bus departure. Matthew waited until the last passenger boarded, then approached. "We're trying to locate someone," he explained, showing the photo. "She might have been here in the last day or two." The attendant squinted at the image. "She does look familiar. I recall a woman traveling alone, seemed pretty jumpy, asked about connections to Philadelphia. Might be her. She left early yesterday, if I remember right. Jamie tugged on Matthew's sleeve. That has to be Mom, he whispered. Matthew's pulse sped up. Thank you, he told the attendant. Do you have any other information? The man shrugged. She asked if there were more buses going south after Philly. I told her yes, but she didn't buy any additional ticket at my window. She might have decided at the terminal in Philly. Matthew nodded, heart sinking a bit at the realization that Stella could be almost anywhere by now. Thanks again, he said. They exited the bus station, the late morning sun glaring off the sidewalk. Jamie looked crushed, though not entirely surprised. She's just running, he murmured. But why? Matthew set a hand on his son's shoulder. We still don't know, he said. Let's stop for lunch, then maybe check that motel lead in New Jersey, one step at a time. Jamie managed a small nod. They slipped into a nearby cafe, ordering sandwiches they barely tasted, their minds preoccupied with thoughts of Stella's reasons for fleeing. Financial trouble was a likely culprit, but Matthew couldn't shake the feeling there might be more. Would a mother truly abandon her child just to avoid debt collectors? Or was there something darker at play? An hour later, they were back in the car, heading toward the highways that would take them into New Jersey. Jamie picked at the frayed seam of his hoodie, occasionally glancing at Matthew with questions in his eyes he didn't quite know how to voice. In turn, Matthew found himself looking at his son's profile, seeing a reflection of his own jawline, a subtle echo of his features. It was both surreal and intensely real, a bond forged in the blink of an eye. Eventually, they left the bustle of the city behind, merging onto quieter roads. The directions from Stella's notes led them to a worn-down motel just off a major interstate. The vacancy sign buzzed weakly under the midday sun, and peeling letters announced a small front office. Matthew pulled into a parking spot near a row of cheaply built rooms with chipped paint. Jamie hesitated once they got out, eyeing the place with a mixture of dread and hope. The lot was almost empty, a few scattered vehicles parked at odd angles. Ready? Matthew asked, keeping his voice gentle. Jamie drew in a breath and nodded. Let's go. They approached the office, where a musty odor greeted them as soon as they stepped inside. A lone overhead fan squeaked lazily, barely stirring the stagnant air. Behind the counter stood an older man with bushy eyebrows, flipping through a small paperback book. He glanced up, looking vaguely annoyed to have customers. Need a room? He grunted. Matthew shook his head, sliding Stella's photo across the counter. We're looking for someone. She might have stayed here recently. The man squinted at the picture. Don't recall. People come and go. Have a name? Stella, Matthew said. She might have used a different last name, Parkinson or Diaz. The man rolled his eyes, reached for a ledger, and flipped through pages. Jamie stood on tiptoe, trying to catch a glimpse, but the handwriting was spidery and half illegible. Minutes passed. The man frowned, tapped a line on the page, then looked up. Yeah, I got a Stella something or other, he said. Checked in a few weeks back for a single night. Didn't leave a forward address. Jamie's eyes lit with sudden energy. That's her, he breathed. Do you remember anything else? The manager shrugged. Not really. She was quiet, paid cash, left early in the morning. Didn't talk much. You said you're looking for her. She owe you money? Nothing like that, Matthew replied sharply, bristling at the man's dismissive tone. She's my friend. We're just concerned. Huh. Sorry I can't help you more, the man said, sliding the ledger aside. Not my business. Matthew reined in his frustration, thanking the man before gathering the photo and leading Jamie back outside. The boy's earlier burst of energy was fading. Always a step behind, he mumbled. I know it's tough, Matthew said, but we're getting closer to understanding her route. She's been in this area. That means she might return, or we can figure out which direction she's going. Jamie nodded, though his expression was bleak. It just feels like she's always 2 days ahead, like we'll never actually find her. A breeze stirred the overgrown weeds near the parking lot, carrying the sounds of passing trucks. Matthew glanced at the rundown facade of the motel. It was the kind of place someone in dire straits might choose, cheap and easy to vanish from without a trace. Was Stella caught in a spiral she couldn't escape? Did she think she was protecting Jamie by staying away? He placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "We're not giving up," he said. "If we keep turning over stones, eventually something will lead us to her." Jamie stared at him, and for a moment it seemed 1,000 questions flickered through the boy's mind. Finally, he just said, "I know," in a voice that was half resignation, half trust in Matthew's unwavering determination. They drove back toward New York, their mood subdued. Once they hit the interstate, Jamie dozed off in the passenger seat, his exhaustion catching up with him. Matthew spared occasional glances at the sleeping child, heart twisted with protectiveness. The idea that they were a family, however unorthodox their circumstances, brought a fierce resolve surging within him. Stella might be running, but he was going to keep Jamie safe. And if Stella needed help, he would do everything in his power to provide it. As the afternoon light softened into gold, they finally reached Westchester again. Jamie stirred awake, blinking in confusion at the sight of the familiar neighborhood. Neither of them felt much like cooking, so they settled on takeout from a nearby pizzeria. While they waited for their order, Jamie wandered around the small waiting area, leafing through dusty brochures advertising local attractions. "You ever go to an amusement park?" Jamie asked suddenly, glancing at Matthew. Matthew considered the question, startled by the abrupt change in topic. "It's been years," he admitted. "Haven't had much reason to." Jamie looked down at the brochure, which featured roller coasters and a cartoonish mascot. "Mom and I always said we'd go someday, but we never did." Matthew felt a pang of sadness for all the small joys Jamie had missed. "Tell you what," he said softly. "Once things settle, maybe we'll go. You and me." A fragile smile tugged at the boy's lips. "I'd like that." They picked up their pizza, drove home, and ate at the kitchen island. Jamie was quieter than usual, likely exhausted by the fruitless search. After they finished, Matthew suggested they watch a movie. Jamie agreed with a small shrug. They chose something lighthearted, some animated fantasy that offered an escape from real-life worries. Midway through the film, Matthew's phone buzzed. He paused the movie, heart quickening as he saw Detective Ramos's number again. Jamie muted the TV, eyes locked on Matthew. "Detective," Matthew said, tension coiling. Ramos's voice crackled on the line, measured but urgent. "We might have a real lead this time." A woman matching Stella's description checked into a women's shelter in Philadelphia late last night. The staff recognized her from the missing persons report. They said she used a different name, but the details match. The shelter reached out once they realized. Matthew's hand clenched around the phone. "Thank God," he murmured. "Is she still there?" "As of now, yes. They convinced her to stay the night. She claimed she was in trouble, something about old debts. They're holding her for questioning, but it's voluntary. She hasn't said much." Relief surged through Matthew, tempered by concern. "We'll head there immediately. Jamie's with me." Ramos agreed, saying he'd keep them updated. As Matthew hung up, Jamie's eyes were wide. "They found her." "They think so," Matthew confirmed, trying to contain a swirl of emotions: relief, dread, hope. "She's at a shelter in Philly. We can drive down tonight, or maybe first thing tomorrow." Jamie, breath-catching, started to stand. "Let's go now, please." Matthew hesitated. "It's getting late, but..." He saw the raw urgency in his son's face, The way Jamie's posture tensed as though fearing a missed moment could lead to losing her all over again. "All right," Matthew relented, grabbing his keys. "Let's do it." They turned off the TV, quickly gathered essentials, and headed for the car. Night had fallen, but adrenaline fueled them both. As Matthew guided the car onto the highway, he shot a sidelong glance at Jamie, whose jaw was set with nervous anticipation. The idea of seeing Stella after all this time, knowing she kept Jamie's birth a secret, made Matthew's chest clench. He wondered how she'd react to his presence. Yet the boy deserved answers, deserved some glimpse of closure or reconciliation. If Stella was safe, perhaps they could finally piece together the puzzle of her disappearance. Perhaps they could forge a path forward even if it was complicated. For now, Matthew just wanted to hold on to the fragile hope that this story wouldn't end in more heartbreak. Please remember to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with friends. They drove through the night toward Philadelphia, the interstate streaked with headlights and the occasional glow of distant cityscapes. The steady hum of the engine formed a backdrop for Jamie's anxious silence in the passenger seat. Every so often, Matthew glanced over, noticing how the boy's fingers drummed against his knees or how his gaze flicked to the window as if scanning the darkness for answers. Matthew understood that tension all too well. After all, they were both bracing themselves for a confrontation they never expected to face. Several hours later, they pulled off the highway onto a quiet street, dotted with shabby row houses and corner stores. The GPS led them to a modest building with a wooden sign out front reading Providence House, Women's Shelter in fading letters. The neighborhood was still, but dim streetlights revealed chipped stoops and iron-barred windows. A few cars parked along the curb hinted that some life stirred behind the gray facades. Matthew parked, took a steadying breath, and turned to Jamie. "Ready?" he asked softly. The boy looked pale in the glow of the overhead light. His hands were clasped, knuckles white. What if she doesn't want to see me?" he whispered. "What if she runs again?" Matthew reached out, laying a comforting hand on Jamie's shoulder. "Then we'll deal with that, but we have to try." Jamie swallowed hard and nodded. Together they climbed out of the car. A single street lamp cast elongated shadows as they walked up to the shelter's front door, a battered metal entrance with a small buzzer panel. Matthew pressed the button labeled "Office." After a moment of muffled sounds from within, the door clicked. He pushed it open, leading Jamie into a cramped lobby that smelled of disinfectant and stale coffee. A night staffer sat behind a desk, her kind but tired eyes flicking up at them. She wore a worn sweater and had her hair pulled back in a neat bun. "Can I help you?" she asked, glancing between Matthew and Jamie. Matthew cleared his throat. "We're looking for Stella. The police said she might be here." Recognition flashed in the staffer's gaze. She frowned, checking a clipboard. "Are you relatives? Because she's been pretty closed off about giving personal details." Jamie stiffened and Matthew slid an arm around his son's shoulders. "She's my..." He paused, then forced himself to say it plainly. "His mother. We've been searching for her. We got word she came in last night." Something in the staffer's expression softened at the sight of Jamie's anxiety. She stood, gesturing for them to follow. "She's in one of our private rooms. We convinced her to stay, but I'm not sure how eager she'll be to talk." They walked down a narrow corridor, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Jamie's breath grew shallow, as if he expected Stella to disappear again any moment. At the end of the hall stood a simple wooden door. The staffer knocked lightly. "Stella? There's someone here to see you." Silence. Then a muffled voice, barely audible through the door. "I don't want visitors." The staffer shot Matthew and Jamie a sympathetic look before speaking again. "It's important. Please, just for a minute." When no immediate response came, she slowly pushed the door open, stepping inside. Through the gap, Matthew glimpsed a small room with a single bed, a dresser, and a bare window covered by threadbare curtains. Jamie clutched at the edge of Matthew's coat. Matthew felt his heart pounding. Moments later, the staffer re-emerged, beckoning them in. She'll talk, she said quietly, though her tone suggested that Stella wasn't exactly thrilled. Matthew guided Jamie inside. The room was lit by a single lamp on the dresser, casting soft shadows. And there, perched on the edge of the bed, sat Stella. She looked thinner than in the photo Jamie carried, her hair tangled and her eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. She wore a worn-out hoodie and clutched a small duffel bag on her lap. Her gaze flicked to Jamie, then to Matthew, and her face went rigid. "Oh, God," she whispered, her voice catching. Jamie froze, tears welling. He took one small step forward. "Mom?" Stella's posture seemed to cave. She bit her lip, struggling to hold back a rush of emotion. "Jamie, what are you doing here?" she finally managed, though her voice trembled with worry rather than relief. He glanced at Matthew, the protective presence at his side. I flew to New York like you told me to, but you never came," he said quietly, twisting his fingers together. Stella closed her eyes, shaking her head. I couldn't. Everything got so complicated. You were supposed to wait, maybe get a bus to your grandfather's. He promised he would meet you in New York, but then his phone got disconnected. She choked on her own explanation, tears brimming. "I know it sounds crazy, but I couldn't stay. You have no idea who was after me." Jamie stumbled forward, tears streaking his cheeks, and Stella stood, catching him in a swift embrace. For a moment, mother and son clung to each other, their breathing ragged with pent-up fear. Matthew held back, a silent witness to the reunion. "It's okay," Jamie murmured, though he was crying too. "I was so scared something happened to you." Stella stroked Jamie's hair, closing her eyes as though she wanted to remember his face forever. "I'm sorry," she kept repeating in a trembling whisper. "I'm so sorry." After a moment, Stella's gaze lifted and landed on Matthew. Recognition sparked, and with it came panic. She pushed Jamie gently aside, her expression hardening. "Matthew Fletcher," she said, voice tight. How?" Her eyes flashed to Jamie. Realization and guilt collided in her features. Matthew stepped forward, hands raised in a gesture of calm. "Yes, it's me," he said softly. "I found Jamie at the airport. He had no one else. He's been staying with me. We did a paternity test, Stella." Her eyes fluttered shut. "I didn't want you to know," she murmured, voice thick with tears. It wasn't part of the plan." Jamie's mouth trembled. "Why not?" he asked, confusion and hurt mingling on his face. "He's my dad. He didn't know about me. Why wouldn't you just tell him?" Stella sank onto the bed, burying her face in her hands. "I couldn't," she began, drawing a shaky breath. "There were reasons. I thought you'd be better off without me, without him. I tried to handle it all alone, but I messed up everything." Matthew shot a worried glance at Jamie, then approached Stella slowly, lowering his voice. "We don't need every detail right now. We just need to know you're safe and that Jamie has you in his life. He's been terrified." Stella lifted her face, anguish etched in every line. "I'm not safe," she said, voice ragged. "We're not safe. That's why I ran." Confusion churned in Matthew's stomach. "Safe from whom?" She swallowed, tears glistening on her cheeks. "There's this man, Norman Ellis. I owe him money. A lot of money. He's been threatening me. I thought if I kept Jamie hidden, he'd be safe. Then I thought sending him to New York would buy me time to figure things out. I never expected you to be the one who found him, but maybe it's fate." Jamie watched his mother with wide, fearful eyes. "He threatened you?" he asked, voice trembling. "You never told me." Stella reached for his hand, clutching it with desperate strength. "I did what I could to keep you from the worst of it," she said. "It started as small loans, then ballooned out of control. I took a bus to Philly because someone told me they could help me get rid of him, but it fell through. I ended up here at the shelter alone." Matthew exhaled slowly, trying to stay calm despite the surge of protective fury swirling within him. "How much do you owe?" Stella's lips parted, but it seemed she couldn't bear to speak the figure. Finally, she muttered a sum that made Matthew's stomach lurch. It wasn't just a few thousand. It was enough to bury an average person under a mountain of debt. A debt of this size, combined with a predatory lender who relied on intimidation, could easily ruin lives. "Why didn't you come to me for help?" he asked, quietly furious. "If you had told me from the start." She let out a bitter laugh, tears in her eyes. "Would you have believed me back then? We barely knew each other, Matthew. You were so busy, so obsessed with your career, and after I got pregnant, I was scared you'd think I was trying to trap you. She broke off, a sob cutting through her explanation. "I was too proud and too ashamed." Jamie clutched Stella's sleeve. "Mom," he murmured, tears glistening on his own lashes. "You don't have to hide anymore. Dad and I will help." The single word, "Dad," made Stella inhale sharply, and she flicked her gaze to Matthew with mingled guilt and relief. For a breath, no one spoke, caught in the tense swirl of raw emotion. Finally, Stella tried to steady herself. "I've made so many mistakes," she said, brushing stray hair away from her face. "But I want to fix this. If you can help me, I'll pay you back whatever it takes." Matthew took a step closer. "We'll figure out the money situation. Right now, you need rest. And Jamie, he needs reassurance that you're here, that you won't vanish again." Stella's eyes brimmed with tears, and she turned to Jamie, hugging him tightly. "I won't," she whispered, voice cracking. "I promise I'll try to make this right." Jamie clung to her, a mixture of relief and lingering fear on his face. Matthew stood by, heart knotted with concern, wondering whether Stella realized she didn't have to carry this burden alone anymore. They had a child together, and while Matthew wished he'd known years earlier, the fact remained they were connected by something deeper than fear or debt. Moments later, the staffer from the shelter popped her head in, clearing her throat gently. "I'm sorry, but we need to confirm who's authorized to leave with Stella, or if she's checking out on her own. The police asked us to keep her here until they could have a conversation." Stella stiffened, uncertainty flickering. "They're going to ask questions about Norman," she murmured. Matthew offered a tentative smile. "Let them. This guy is threatening you. You shouldn't be handling it alone. If the police get involved, maybe we can secure protection." She nodded, though her expression was weary. "I just hope they can do anything." Jamie gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "Dad's rich," he said suddenly, boyish earnestness overriding any tact. "He can, hire guards or something." A surprised laugh burst from Stella's lips, followed by tears. She wiped her eyes, then cast Matthew a cautious glance. "Are you really going to do all that?" Matthew answered calmly, though inside he was still reeling from the reality of fatherhood, of this entire tangled situation. "If that's what it takes," he said. "Money can't fix everything, but it can help us navigate this. And I have resources beyond just money. People who can track Norman down or gather evidence. The important thing is you and Jamie are safe." A tear slipped down Stella's cheek. She bent her head, struggling for composure. At last, she exhaled, looking up with a gratitude so raw it nearly broke Matthew's heart. "Thank you," she whispered. The staffer in the doorway cleared her throat again, The police said they'll be by in the morning. We can offer Stella a bed for one more night. Or if she feels safe going with you, she can sign out and we'll notify them, but she'll have to come back if the detective wants her statement. Stella hesitated, glancing between Jamie and Matthew. Her brow creased with doubt. I don't want to cause any trouble. You're not causing trouble, Matthew assured her, standing taller. My house is in Westchester, a quiet area. I have a security system. We can get you settled, and in the morning we'll coordinate with the police on next steps. Jamie tugged on Stella's hand, eyes pleading. Please come with us. I don't want to be away from you again. Something in Stella's posture surrendered. She turned to the staffer. I'll leave with them tonight. You have my info, and I'll cooperate with the detective. The staffer nodded, scribbling on a clipboard. We'll let them know. I hope everything turns out okay. Stella gathered her duffel bag, still appearing somewhat dazed as she followed Matthew and Jamie out of the shelter. The night air felt cold, but this time they walked together, united in a precarious new start. Jamie clung to Stella's hand, and Stella kept glancing at Matthew as though still trying to believe this was real. Once in the car, Stella slid into the back seat, Jamie beside her, while Matthew got behind the wheel. He glanced at them in the rearview mirror, struck by how fragile they both seemed, yet how relief glowed in Jamie's eyes. Stella's face remained etched with worry, but there was also a flicker of hope. Are you hungry? Matthew asked quietly, turning the key in the ignition. He realized how that question felt almost laughably domestic, given the magnitude of everything. Stella shook her head. Not really. Just tired. Matthew nodded. We'll head straight back then. No one spoke for the first part of the ride. Stella watched the city lights blur by outside the window, her fingertips gripping Jamie's. Occasionally, Jamie looked up at her as if to confirm she was truly there. The highway stretched on under a pale moon, and Matthew couldn't stop replaying Stella's confession about the debt. A man named Norman had driven her into desperation. She'd sacrificed everything, including a real childhood for Jamie, to keep them both afloat. Eventually, Matthew broke the silence. Stella, we have a lot to talk about, but I want you to know, no matter what happened before, I'm here now, and I'm not letting Norman hurt either of you. Stella's reflection in the rearview mirror showed tears welling in her eyes again. She whispered, I was so afraid. But maybe you're right. Maybe we have a chance to fix things. Jamie squeezed her hand, nodding emphatically. We do, he said, voice trembling with earnestness. They passed the familiar sign welcoming them back toward Westchester, the roads thinning as the city lights gave way to suburban calm. Tension still underpinned the car ride, but there was something else as well, a sense of tentative unity. By the time they pulled into Matthew's driveway, Stella looked utterly exhausted, strands of hair clinging to her damp cheeks. Jamie was practically dozing against her shoulder, lulled by relief. Matthew parked, cut the engine, and exhaled. Let's get inside. Inside, Stella's eyes moved over the stylish modern decor, the immaculate floors, the vaulted ceilings. She blinked, momentarily speechless. Jamie yawned, half asleep, but rallied when Matthew nudged him gently. You two can take the guest room, Matthew offered. There's a bathroom right across the hall. We'll talk more in the morning. Stella set her duffel down in the foyer. Thank you, she said quietly. She looked uncertain, as if waiting for some judgment from Matthew about her choices. But he only gave a tired, understanding nod, guiding them to the large guest room that once seemed spacious and empty, but was now taking on the shape of a family sanctuary. Jamie threw his arms around Matthew, surprising him with a quick, tight hug. Night, Dad, he mumbled. The words still sent a small thrill through Matthew's chest. Stella watched the exchange, tears filling her eyes again, but she said nothing. After helping them settle, Matthew retreated to his own room, leaning against the door once he shut it. He felt as if the entire day had been a fever dream, reuniting Stella and Jamie, learning she'd fled from a dangerous debt collector, and navigating a swarm of unanswered questions about how they'd move forward. But one thing was certain. Stella was here. Jamie was here. And Matthew had become an anchor they both desperately needed. Fatigue washed over him, but he couldn't rest easily. He grabbed his phone, scrolling through contacts. He had connections in law enforcement, private security, financial circles. If Norman was truly a threat, Matthew would use every resource to ensure Stella and Jamie's safety. It was time to turn the page on secrets and fear and forge something that resembled a real future. He set the phone down, his eyes drifting to the darkened window. The events of the night still buzzed in his mind. Tomorrow they'd speak to the detective, possibly involve lawyers or security professionals. Tomorrow, he'd also confront Stella about all the missing years, about why she kept Jamie hidden. It would be messy, but necessary. For now, he had to cling to the small hope that this broken puzzle could be pieced back together. Exhaustion won at last, and Matthew sank onto the bed fully clothed, letting his eyes slide shut. A family, he thought, letting the word play at the edges of his consciousness. A family. However improbable and fractured, it was there. And he intended to protect it with every ounce of resolve he possessed. Please remember to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with friends. Morning found Matthew in the midst of the same uneasy sleep that had claimed him in the small hours, fully clothed on top of his bed. When sunlight finally pried his eyes open, a moment of disorientation left him blinking at the high ceiling. Then the events of the previous night surged back into sharp focus. Stella's arrival at the women's shelter, her confession about the debt collector, and the tearful reunion with their son. He exhaled, rolling to the edge of the mattress and scrubbing a hand over his face. He felt both hopeful and guarded, as if standing on fragile ground. He rose, still wearing yesterday's clothes, and padded into the hallway. The house was quiet, save for the distant hum of the heating system. It occurred to him that Stella might not be used to the stillness of a place like this, given the constant upheaval she'd described. As he descended the stairs, he mentally rehearsed the questions he needed to ask. How she had come to owe Norman Ellis such a crippling sum, why she had never reached out, and what her future would be now that she was no longer on the run. In the kitchen, he found Jamie already up, leaning against the counter with a glass of milk. The boy looked exhausted but alert, his brow creased with silent concerns. When Matthew offered a gentle smile, Jamie tried to return it. "Mom's still asleep," he murmured. "She woke up once during the night, but then went back to bed. I guess she's really tired." Matthew nodded, pouring himself a cup of coffee he barely wanted to drink. "She's been through a lot," he said softly. "You too. I'm sorry everything's been so hard." Jamie set down his glass, fiddling with the hem of his t-shirt. "At least she's here," he replied, trying to sound brave. "Do you think she'll stay?" Matthew took a sip of coffee. The bitterness made him wince, and he realized he had no easy answers. "That's up to her," he conceded. "But I'm hoping she'll choose to face this together. We don't have to figure it all out alone anymore." They heard the sound of soft footsteps in the hallway. Stella appeared at the threshold, hair mussed and eyes puffy from crying or lack of sleep. She wore the same hoodie she'd arrived in, arms wrapped around herself as if warding off a chill. For an instant she hesitated, seeming almost afraid to step fully into the room. Then her gaze fell on Jamie and Matthew, and she made herself move forward. "Hi," she said, voice hushed. "Didn't mean to interrupt." "You're not interrupting," Matthew said, setting his mug aside. "There's coffee if you want some, or I can fix you breakfast." He tried to keep his tone light, though every muscle in his body felt coiled. Stella gave a wavering nod. "Coffee would be nice," she whispered. Jamie slipped off his stool. "I'll get it," he offered, disappearing into the kitchen's adjoining nook. That left Matthew and Stella facing each other in an awkward hush. Finally, he gestured toward the table, and they both sat down, just a few feet apart. "I know we have a lot to talk about," Matthew began. "But first, are you feeling okay? Do you need anything?" She shook her head, eyes flicking toward the doorway where Jamie was rummaging for cups. "Just a shower, maybe. Some fresh clothes. I didn't bring much. I wasn't sure how long I'd be staying." Matthew frowned softly. "You're free to stay as long as you need. We'll talk to the police soon, figure out next steps. I want you and Jamie to be safe." Stella inhaled, tears pricking at her eyes, but she held them back. "I appreciate it," she said in a low voice. "I know I should have told you about Jamie before. You have every right to be angry with me." He considered the knot of emotions in his chest. "I'm hurt," he admitted. "But mostly, I'm sad it took this long. He's an incredible kid. I wish I'd known him all these years." She opened her mouth to respond, but Jamie returned, carrying 2 mugs of coffee on a tray with sugar and cream. He set it on the table with a seriousness that made Matthew's heart ache. Stella mumbled a thank you, and Jamie stood there a moment, uncertain. Finally, he pulled a chair close, as if determined not to be shut out of the conversation. They sipped coffee in quiet for a few minutes. The tension pressed in on all sides, full of everything unspoken, old regrets, new fears, and the fragile sense that they might find a path forward. Stella was the first to break the silence. "Norman Ellis," she said, her voice rough. "I told you last night about him. He's relentless. When I missed payments, he showed up at my apartment, threatened me, demanded I come up with more. He didn't care how. That's when I started traveling, looking for someone who could offer me a job under the table. It never worked out." Matthew nodded. "How did you meet him originally?" Stella took another shaky breath. "I was in Chicago, barely scraping by. He owned some corner shops and did loans on the side. I needed money for rent, got stuck in a cycle of interest fees I couldn't pay. It spiraled." Jamie's face tightened with anxiety. "Could he find you here?" Stella swallowed, her gaze flicking toward the window as if expecting Norman to burst in. "He finds people. I don't know how far his reach is, but I'm worried." Matthew leaned forward, gentling his voice. "Let me talk to some people. I have contacts in security, possibly in law enforcement. The police know you're cooperating, so maybe we can get some protection. In the meantime, you can stay here. We'll get you clothes and whatever else you need." She nodded, lips trembling as she tried to smile. "Thank you." Her gaze moved to Jamie, lingering on him with a mix of guilt and affection. "I'm sorry I dragged you into this." He touched her arm timidly. "You didn't drag me. I'm your son," he said with quiet intensity. "I just want to help, but I don't know how." Stella wrapped an arm around him, pressing her forehead against his. Matthew watched them, that fierce protectiveness welling again. Even though the situation was dire, he was glad Jamie could finally see his mother and father in the same space, working to keep him safe. They finished their coffee, and Matthew stood. "I'll make a few calls," he said, gesturing to Stella that she was welcome to shower or rest. "Jamie can show you where everything is." She nodded, still looking drained, and Jamie took her hand to lead her upstairs. Left alone, Matthew exhaled, running a hand over his jaw. He pulled out his phone and dialed the detective's number. After several rings, Detective Ramos picked up, sounding more awake than last night. "Thanks for following up," Matthew said. launching into an explanation of Stella's presence in his home. Ramos replied that they needed to get her official statement and that if Norman was truly a criminal loan shark, there might be a broader investigation. Matthew gleaned from the conversation that police resources were spread thin, so the best approach might be private security combined with cooperation from local authorities. It was a start, though hardly a solution. He moved on to call a former colleague who ran a small security firm. After a brief conversation, they agreed to meet that evening to discuss installing more cameras, possibly hiring a guard if Stella felt threatened. The cost didn't faze Matthew. His primary concern was ensuring that no one could hurt Jamie or Stella again. Once those calls ended, Matthew realized the day was slipping by, and he should check on Stella and Jamie. He climbed the stairs and found the guest room door ajar. Stella had emerged from the shower, wearing some clothes of his she'd borrowed, the sleeves and pant legs rolled up. Jamie hovered at her side, as if afraid she might vanish again. Stella looked unexpectedly fragile in the oversized garments, her hair still damp against her shoulders. Matthew lingered in the hallway, not wanting to intrude, but when she spotted him, she offered a shy, almost apologetic wave. "Thanks for letting me use your stuff," she said, self-conscious. "I'll replace it as soon as possible." He shook his head. "No rush. We'll go shopping for you if we need to." Then, glancing at Jamie, he added, "I called the detective. We need to go in for your statement, but it might not be until tomorrow. They're short-staffed." Stella's shoulders tensed. "All right. Let's just get it over with." Matthew nodded. "Until then, I have a friend who runs a security firm. He's coming by tonight. I want to make sure you're safe here." She swallowed, eyes glistening with relief and residual worry. "You really don't have to go through all that trouble," she said, though her tone betrayed a longing for reassurance. "It's not trouble," Matthew insisted gently. "I should have been there for you before. Let me help now." Jamie watched them, gaze darting between his parents. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on him. Matthew could see it in the way the boy clung to Stella's sleeve. In that subtle posture, fear mingled with an unspoken plea that they stay together, no matter the cost. Stella finally exhaled. "All right, thank you." They migrated downstairs to the living room. Outside, the day had turned bright, sunbeams illuminating the large windows. When Stella stepped closer to the glass, she seemed surprised by the tranquility of the yard, neatly trimmed hedges, a small patio. She stared out at the tree line, arms folded. "It's peaceful here," she observed, voice soft. "I spent so long just running." Matthew came to stand beside her. "You don't have to run anymore," he said. "We can figure out a plan, negotiate the debt, involve the authorities, do whatever is necessary." Stella turned toward him, tears brimming once more. "I'm not sure Norman will negotiate. He likes to make examples of people who cross him." Matthew's jaw tightened. "Then we'll protect you." She looked away, uneasy. "I'm not used to depending on anyone, especially not you. Back in Chicago, you were so focused on your company. I told myself you wouldn't care about me or Jamie." He exhaled. "I'm sorry. I had no idea. If I'd known you were pregnant, if I'd known about Norman..." She nodded, her voice catching as she cut in. "I was scared. And by the time I tried to gather the courage to tell you, too much time had passed. Then Jamie was born, and I convinced myself you'd reject us." Behind them, Jamie quietly approached, drawn by the intensity of their conversation. Matthew reached out, tugging the boy gently into the circle of tension. "I wouldn't have rejected you," he said, "but we can't change the past. Let's focus on now." Stella touched Jamie's cheek, as though marveling at his presence. Her hand shook slightly. "I'll do my best," she promised, voice breaking. "For him." Jamie pressed closer, a fragile but undeniable warmth settling around them. Matthew rested a hand on each of their shoulders. Despite the threat lurking in the background, despite all the turmoil, they were here, together. It felt like the first step on an unsteady path that might, if navigated carefully, lead them towards something resembling wholeness. The sun climbed higher, lighting the living room with a gentle glow. They stood there for a moment longer, allowing themselves just a taste of peace after weeks, years in Stella's case, of relentless uncertainty. Then, slowly, they began to talk about next steps, letting the police know her side of the story, contacting the security firm, and figuring out how to keep Jamie safe at school once he enrolled. Each detail felt monumental, but tackling them one by one gave them a structure to hold on to. By the time they finished, Stella looked drained but determined. Jamie sat on the couch, fiddling with a blanket edge, eyes bright with an odd mixture of hope and lingering tension. Matthew watched them both, feeling something deep inside shift. He was no longer just a solitary CEO. He was a father, a protector, and maybe, if Stella allowed it, a partner in rebuilding their fractured lives. The unknowns were daunting, yet he sensed that if they held steady, they just might reach the other side intact. Please remember to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with friends. Stella stood in the living room after they had hashed out their preliminary plan, her arms folded tight, as though she feared everything might dissolve in a single misstep. She was still wearing Matthew's clothes, the cuffs bunched at her wrists, and she looked at him with a mix of gratitude and lingering shame. Matthew, sensing her unease, touched her shoulder gently, trying to convey that he held no anger about her earlier deceptions, only a resolve to protect their son. Jamie hovered by the arm of the sofa, absorbing every nuance, his expression shifting between relief that his mother was safe and worry about whatever trials might come next. He had never known life to be free from anxiety. In some ways, living here felt more stable than anything he could remember, yet the looming threat of Norman Ellis robbed him of the peace he craved. Still, seeing his parents united, even tentatively, gave him a spark of hope. Late that morning, a faint ring at the front door announced the arrival of Matthew's old colleague, Thomas Langley, who ran the small but reputable security firm. He stepped inside with a quick professional demeanor, nodding politely to Stella and Jamie before focusing on Matthew. With short graying hair and a trim build, Thomas exuded the calm confidence of someone who had dealt with crises far more volatile than an indebted mother seeking refuge. He carried a black briefcase containing files and brochures, as well as a tablet loaded with potential security measures. While Stella retreated to the kitchen to give them space, Jamie sat on the edge of the couch, his knee bouncing, as Matthew led Thomas through the house, pointing out every door, window, and vulnerable angle that might concern them. Though the day was bright, the conversation felt fraught with the shadows cast by Norman's looming presence, and Matthew found himself scanning every corner. When they reached the study, Thomas set down his materials on the large desk and began explaining the most urgent steps. First, he recommended reinforcing the locks and installing a more advanced alarm system that would alert not just the local authorities, but also Thomas's security team in the event of forced entry. He showed Matthew images of discrete cameras that could be placed around the perimeter, devices that uploaded footage to a remote server rather than storing it locally. Jamie, peering over the desk, listened intently, as if trying to learn how to fortify their new home against unwelcome intrusions. Thomas also asked questions about Stella's debt, whether there was a paper trail that could help identify Norman's associates, and how likely it might be that Norman would resort to violence. Matthew answered as best he could, referencing Stella's frantic confessions, though he recognized they still lacked crucial details. After about an hour of intensive discussion, Thomas gave them a rough estimate of the cost and timeline for implementing everything. He promised to have a few men start work within days, at least on the alarm system and camera setup. Stella, lingering in the doorway, stepped forward with her arms crossed, clearly uncomfortable at the notion that Matthew might shoulder so much expense. She attempted to protest, insisting she had no right to accept his financial help. But Matthew cut her off gently, reminding her that Norman's threats affected them all. Jamie, for his part, seemed relieved to see someone taking decisive steps. The boy's gaze flicked from his mother's anxious face to Matthew's determined stance, and if he worried about the cost, he never said so. Whatever guilt Stella felt, she eventually conceded that ensuring Jamie's safety had to come first, no matter how it stung her pride. When Thomas finally departed, promising to return the next day with a small crew, Stella exhaled shakily. She confessed that the thought of security cameras and alarm codes felt alien, but if it kept Norman at bay, she would learn to handle it. As they watched Thomas's car drive off, Matthew touched her elbow, guiding her back inside where Jamie waited. It was almost noon, and the thought of lunch reminded Matthew that Stella and Jamie both needed nourishment, proper meals, some semblance of normalcy to ground them. Over sandwiches and fruit in the kitchen, conversation drifted between mundane topics and the unrelenting anxiety surrounding Norman. Stella mentioned how she'd once tried to pay him back through small jobs, but every time she cleared one debt, new fees emerged, ensnaring her further. Matthew listened, jaws tightening in anger, though he tried to keep his voice calm for Jamie's sake. In the afternoon, Detective Ramos called, instructing Stella to come to the station early the next morning for a formal statement. Stella's hand shook when she hung up, though she squared her shoulders, determined to see it through. Jamie hovered nearby, racked by the fear that this ordeal might lead to more disruption in their fragile lives. Matthew offered to drive them both, promising he wouldn't let the system shuffle Stella away or treat her as a criminal. If anything, Norman was the perpetrator, and Stella was yet another victim of his predatory lending. That evening, as dusk settled over the suburban streets, tension hummed like static in the air. Jamie found some measure of distraction with a puzzle in the living room, occasionally beckoning Stella to join him, perhaps wanting to anchor her to the present moment. She did, kneeling by the coffee table to help him fit the last pieces. Matthew slipped into his study once more, determined to uncover any lead that might further protect Stella. Through a contact in Chicago, he managed to retrieve the address where Norman operated most of his backroom dealings. It was rumored that Norman employed enforcers, individuals who specialized in collecting debts through intimidation and violence. The stories made Matthew's stomach churn. He didn't want to alarm Stella further, but burying his head in the sand was not an option. When he emerged from the study, he found Stella tucking Jamie into bed in the guest room. The sight of her smoothing her son's hair, a faint tremor in her fingers, pierced Matthew with a deep ache. She'd tried to protect Jamie on her own for so long, making flawed choices in desperation, only to have fate thrust them together at last. He stood quietly in the hallway until Stella slipped out and closed the door behind her. She faced Matthew, arms folded defensively, though her expression was softer than before. He asked if everything would be normal once we talked to the detective, she said, voice trembling. How do I explain to him that normal might never be what he's used to? Not when I've made so many mistakes and put him in danger. Matthew shook his head. It isn't just on you anymore, he reminded her, keeping his tone firm but kind. We do this as a family. If that means we have to create a new normal, so be it. We'll keep Jamie safe, settle your debts, and hopefully ensure Norman never touches any of us again. Stella nodded, tears threatening. For a moment she drifted closer, as if contemplating leaning on him. Then with a wavering smile she thanked him and moved toward her own room. He flicked off the hallway light, resolving that tomorrow's challenges would be met with resolve and mutual faith. Remember to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with friends. For them, The night held a fragile promise of unity, built on quiet hope. Morning came early, bringing a sharp autumn chill to the air that settled across Matthew's Westchester property. He stood in the kitchen, warming his hands around a steaming mug of coffee, and stared through the window at the meticulously trimmed hedges. A soft layer of dew glistened on every leaf, reminding him how even the smallest things in life could hold beauty if one looked closely enough. Yet in the back of his mind, all he could see were storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Everything hinged on what would happen today at the police station: Stella's statement, the path toward handling Norman Ellis, and the precarious future of the small family they had become. He glanced over his shoulder when he heard light footsteps. Jamie was at the threshold, hair ruffled and eyes still heavy with sleep. "Hey, Dad," the boy said, voice hushed as though he feared breaking the fragile calm of dawn. Hearing that simple word, Dad, stirred a mix of gratitude and responsibility in Matthew's chest. His resolve to protect Jamie felt fiercer with each passing hour. "Morning, kid," Matthew replied, ruffling Jamie's hair. "Did you sleep okay?" Jamie shrugged. "Kinda. Kept thinking about today." He rubbed his arms through the sleeves of his hoodie, casting a glance toward the stairs. "Mom still asleep?" Matthew nodded. "She needed the rest. The detective wants us there by 10, so we have some time." Setting his mug on the counter, he reached into the cupboard and pulled out a box of cereal. "Hungry?" Jamie managed a half smile. "Sure, I'll get the bowls." They moved around the kitchen in a careful dance, mindful not to disturb Stella. The house felt too quiet, like a place holding its breath. Over the past days, it had become a haven for them, though the looming threat of Norman Ellis stained every moment with tension. If Matthew had to guess, he would have said Jamie's nightmares continued. Whenever the boy fell silent, worry seemed to flicker in his eyes, as if he feared everything might disappear at any second. They finished a simple breakfast. Just as Matthew began rinsing the dishes, Stella emerged in the hallway, hair loose around her shoulders, wearing a fresh set of the clothes Matthew had purchased for her online, a pair of jeans and a light sweater. She offered a small smile, exhaustion lingering in her gaze. "Sorry I slept so long," she said. "Guess I needed it." Jamie set down his spoon and went to hug her. "It's okay," he murmured. "We're eating cereal if you want some." She nodded, glancing shyly at Matthew. He sensed her unease, that ever-present blend of gratitude and guilt, and he steered the conversation away from heavy topics. "We'll leave in about an hour," he said, gesturing toward the clock. "We can take one car, talk to Detective Ramos, then figure out lunch afterward." Stella swallowed. "All right, let me grab something quick, then I'll get ready." They left for the police station with Jamie in the back seat, Stella up front, and Matthew driving. The crisp air lent a stark clarity to the morning, the sun blazing a pale gold across the sky. No one spoke much during the ride. Each was lost in private reflection, mentally rehearsing how to handle the day's questions. Matthew gripped the steering wheel, reminding himself that no matter how complicated Stella's story might be, she was a victim of Norman's menacing tactics. Ramos had seemed sympathetic enough, but police procedures could be slow, and Stella's fear was immediate. The station itself was a solid brick building near the heart of the small downtown area. People bustled along the sidewalk, some on their way to work, others making quick stops at nearby shops. Matthew parked at a metered spot, and Jamie stuck close to Stella as they approached the glass doors. Detective Ramos was waiting just inside, wearing a sport coat and an expression of polite determination. "Ms. Holden?" Ramos said, addressing Stella by her last name. She nodded, and he extended a hand. "I'm Detective Ramos. We spoke on the phone. Thank you for coming in." Stella's voice was shaky. "Sure, let's just get this over with." He gave a quick nod, then greeted Matthew, who offered a grim smile. After shaking Jamie's hand, an act that seemed to put the boy slightly at ease, Ramos led them down a short hallway to a spare interview room with plain walls and a single table. 2 chairs were set up on one side, facing a lone seat on the other. Ramos gestured for Stella to sit on the lone side. Jamie made a small noise of protest, but Stella raised a hand, reassuring him. "It's all right," she murmured. "I'll be okay." Matthew placed a hand on Jamie's shoulder. "We'll be right here." Ramos explained that due to procedural requirements, he wanted Stella's statement on the record without undue influence. Matthew was allowed to remain, but only as an observer. Jamie, for his part, stood behind Stella's chair, refusing to leave. The detective quietly turned on a recording device, labeled it, and began. "State your name, please." "Stella Holden," she said, her voice wavering. "Age?" 32. "Can you tell me about your relationship with Norman Ellis, how you first came to owe him money, and any threats he's made against you or your family?" Stella inhaled, gaze flickering to Jamie for courage. Then slowly she outlined the entire story. Meeting Norman while living in Chicago, falling behind on rent, taking a small loan with steep interest, and the relentless cycles of debt that followed. She spoke of multiple relocations, part-time jobs, and how each time she made a payment, Norman found a way to add more fees or intimidate her into extending the loan. Tears gathered at the corners of her eyes when she described how he once cornered her outside an apartment building, pushing her against a wall and warning her that if she didn't pay up soon, something bad might happen to Jamie. Matthew's hand clenched into a fist at the mental image. Jamie stared at the tabletop, trembling at the mention of that threat. The boy had never heard the full extent of the intimidation tactics. Stella's voice became raw as she recounted fleeing Chicago and drifting among various cities, culminating in the panicked decision to send Jamie on a plane to New York, hoping his grandfather would collect him. Then she'd run again, fearful that Norman's people would track her down. When she finished, the silence felt charged. Detective Ramos leaned forward. "Have you kept any of the documents related to the loans? Even if you don't have them now, do you recall where they might be?" Stella shrugged helplessly. "I had some, but I lost a lot whenever I moved in a hurry. I might still have a few receipts or texts, but it's not much." Ramos took notes, glancing at Matthew. "Would you be willing to allow us access to any phone records, bank statements, or text messages that might prove Mr. Ellis engaged in illegal lending practices?" Matthew nodded. "Whatever she needs, I can also hire investigators to dig through her financial history, see if there's a digital trail." Stella cast him a grateful yet anxious look. "Thank you." Ramos clicked off the recording device. "That's sufficient for a preliminary statement," he said, shifting in his seat. "We'll do what we can, but I'll be honest. Prosecuting Ellis might be challenging if he keeps his operations under the radar. Are you prepared to testify if this goes to court?" Stella's eyes widened slightly, fear dancing across her features. Still, she squared her shoulders and nodded. "If it keeps Jamie safe, yes." Jamie let out a ragged breath of relief. The tension in the room was thick as everyone recognized the risk Stella was taking. Ramos asked them to wait a few minutes in the station's small break area while he filed the paperwork. Stella and Jamie followed Matthew down a short hallway lined with outdated wanted posters, stopping at a set of plastic chairs near a vending machine. The overhead lights buzzed softly, and passing officers sometimes threw them curious glances. Jamie tapped his foot, unable to stay still. "So that's it?" he asked in a whisper. "They just write it all down and then we leave?" Matthew tousled his hair. "It's a start," he said. "They have her story on record now. If Norman tries anything else, it'll strengthen our case." Stella let out a shaky sigh. "I hope it's enough." Shortly, Ramos reappeared, offering Stella a slip of paper with a case number. "We'll reach out if we need more," he said. "In the meantime, if you receive any contact from Norman or his associates, save all evidence, calls, messages, letters. Let me know immediately. Understood?" Stella took the paper, nodding. "Yes." They thanked him, then exited the station. Matthew led them back to the car, the cool afternoon breeze ruffling their clothes. He could tell Stella felt lighter having shared her story, but also petrified by the uncertain path ahead. Jamie said little, but his face had lost some of its drawn tension, as though just witnessing his mother standing up for them both provided a measure of comfort. On the drive home, Matthew suggested they stop for lunch. Stella agreed, sounding hesitant, like she feared spending money on anything that wasn't strictly necessary. But Matthew insisted they deserved a small reprieve after the day's stress. They found a modest diner where the smell of fried bacon and fresh coffee clung to the air. The decor was old-fashioned, full of red vinyl booths, and the waitress greeted them with a bright, toothy smile. Settling into a booth, Jamie pressed close to Stella, scanning the menu. She cast Matthew a grateful look from across the table, as though acknowledging that normal things like ordering a sandwich felt like an unimaginable luxury after years of surviving on the run. They talked about mundane topics, Jamie's taste in music, a funny commercial he'd seen, and the puzzle he'd left half-finished at the house. Neither Stella nor Matthew mentioned Norman or the police. For a short time, they let themselves savor the illusion of an ordinary family lunch. Jamie devoured his burger with a child's appetite, while Stella picked at her salad, occasionally glancing at the diner's door as if checking for threats. Matthew paid the bill discreetly, refusing Stella's attempts to help. Back in the car, the sky took on a softer hue, drifting toward late afternoon. They returned to the house, where two men from Thomas Langley's firm were already at work installing new cameras and reinforcing the locks. Stella watched them from the living room window, hugging herself. "It's good to see we're taking steps," she said, her tone uncertain. "I just hope it's enough." "It's a layer of defense," Matthew replied, trying to reassure her. "We'll keep adding more if we have to." Jamie wandered in, eyes flicking between them. "So, does this mean we can't really go out until it's all done?" Stella touched his shoulder. "We can go out, honey. We just need to be careful." Matthew nodded, striding into the foyer where the security technicians were hauling tools inside. "Once they finish, we'll have a better sense of safety, but we should still stay alert. I'll make sure you don't have to handle anything alone, Stella." She offered a wavering smile. "I appreciate that." Their conversation was interrupted by a text ping on Matthew's phone. He glanced down, brow furrowing at an unknown number. The message read, "Stop digging. Next time it won't just be words." A chill ran through him. Though the text was untraceable, the meaning was clear. He felt a surge of protective anger at the idea that Norman or one of his cronies might already know Stella's location. Jaw tight, Matthew met Stella's eyes, seeing her alarm mirrored there. Jamie noticed too and stepped closer. "What's wrong?" Matthew inhaled deeply, refusing to let fear consume him. "We just got a threat," he said, showing Stella the phone. "But that doesn't change anything. We'll keep pressing forward." She bit her lip, face turning pale. Jamie pressed his back against her as though shielding her from the news. Outside, the security crew hammered away, oblivious to the tension spiraling inside the house. In that moment, Matthew realized how delicate their situation remained, even with the best precautions. One text could shatter any sense of calm, reminding them that Norman's reach extended further than they hoped. Clenching the phone, Matthew led them into the living room. "We report this to Ramos," he said, voice low and controlled. "Let him know we have a direct threat. This is evidence." Stella nodded, shaky but resolute. Yes, let's do that. Jamie cast a worried glance from his mother to Matthew. Are we going to be okay? Matthew bent, looking Jamie in the eye. Yes, he said, heart pounding at the bold promise. We will. We have each other, and we won't back down. That's what matters. Please remember to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with friends. Matthew dialed Detective Ramos right away, relaying the threat on his phone. Stella hovered at his side, breath quickening each time her gaze landed on the words, "Stop digging. Next time it won't just be words." Jamie stayed close to her, one hand clinging to her sweater sleeve, trying not to show the same terror flaring in his eyes. When Ramos picked up, his voice sounded steadier than Matthew felt. After listening to the details, the detective promised to send an officer that evening to collect evidence from the text, cautioning them to remain indoors and let the security team finish installing cameras. He advised Matthew to document any further threats, no matter how small. This is typical intimidation, Ramos warned, but it could escalate if Norman sees you're serious about pushing back. Don't ignore it. Hanging up, Matthew turned to face Stella and Jamie in the living room. She looked pale, one arm curled protectively around their son as if shielding him. The workmen outside banged intermittently, reinforcing doors and testing alarm sensors. That staccato noise echoed the pounding of Matthew's pulse. "We'll be all right," he said again, fighting a tremor in his voice. "Ramos is sending an officer to check the phone. They'll keep an eye on us." Jamie nodded, clenching his jaw. "I won't let him scare me," he said, though his trembling fingers betrayed his fear. Stella brushed a hand over Jamie's hair, pulling him into a gentle hug. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "It's my fault he's after us. Maybe I should leave so he doesn't come for you." "No," Matthew cut in firmly. He stepped closer, glancing between them. "You're not going anywhere. If Norman tries anything, he'll be the one in trouble. We're in this together." His words hung like a lifeline. Stella closed her eyes, nodding. "All right," she breathed. "But I want you both to promise me something. If it gets too dangerous, please keep Jamie safe no matter what." Matthew swallowed hard. "Of course," he said, mustering a tight smile at Jamie. "No one's splitting us up." They passed the afternoon under a tense cloud, each trying not to dwell on the phone's menacing message. The security firm finished installing new sensors by dusk, and Thomas himself tested the system. After double-checking the camera feeds, he showed Matthew how to access real-time footage on his phone. Stella and Jamie hovered behind him, scanning the screens that showed the yard, the driveway, and every vulnerable angle around the house. It gave them a small boost of confidence. Nobody could approach without setting off alarms. Still, the threat clung to them like a shadow. When the officer arrived, a young man named Riley, he greeted them politely and took photos of the text, logging the number into a police database. "We'll see if it connects to any known burners Norman's used," he explained. "For now, stay vigilant." Matthew thanked him, then walked him to the door. Outside, the sun sank behind bare-limbed trees, painting the sky in purples and reds. The officer nodded briskly and left. Matthew lingered in the foyer, wrestling with the sense that Norman was closing in no matter how many locks or cameras they installed. Back in the living room, Jamie sat on the couch, arms around his knees. Stella paced near the window, occasionally peeking through the curtains, wincing at every passing car. Matthew realized they needed a diversion before the stress ate them alive. "Hey," he said softly, trying to catch their attention. "Anyone interested in pizza and a movie?" Jamie managed a faint smile. "We always had cheap pizza," he murmured. "But it's been a while." Stella let out a small laugh, though it came out shaky. "I'd like that." They made the call, ordering from a local pizzeria that delivered quickly. Matthew forced normalcy into the next hour. He set plates on the coffee table, dimmed the overhead lights, and scrolled through streaming options until Jamie settled on an action-adventure flick. Stella hesitated, shooting wary glances at the windows, but when the pizza arrived, she sighed, took a slice, and sat close to Jamie on the couch. The simple act of sharing a meal in the glow of the television soothed their rattled nerves, at least for a moment. Halfway through the film, Jamie's attention drifted from the screen. He reached for the puzzle he'd left on the coffee table days ago and began fitting new pieces into place. Stella joined him, setting her pizza aside and pointing to shapes that matched. Their quiet cooperation felt intimate, fragile. Matthew let them be, content to observe from the armchair. As silly dialogue burst from the TV, he thought about how odd it was to find a semblance of family life while a silent threat loomed outside. After the credits rolled, Stella stifled a yawn and leaned back, as though her body finally remembered it was exhausted. Jamie stretched his arms overhead, blinking at the clock. "It's late," he said, uncertain whether they'd truly be able to sleep. Matthew stood. "I know it's hard, but we should all try. The security system's armed and the cameras will pick up anything unusual. Let's get some rest." Jamie nodded slowly. Then, as if steeling himself, he turned to Stella. "Mom, can we talk for a minute before bed?" She looked startled, but nodded. "Sure." Matthew hesitated before retreating to the hallway, giving them space. He heard murmured words, the gentle tone of Stella's voice, and Jamie's occasional sniffle. A pang shot through him. Jamie still carried so many questions: why she'd left, how the debt had grown so enormous, whether it truly could be fixed. Those answers weren't simple. Yet the murmurs from the living room suggested they were forging a new understanding, mother and son reconnecting after years of half-truths. Eventually, Stella kissed Jamie's forehead. The boy padded upstairs, his footsteps echoing on the polished stairs. Stella lingered, pressing a hand against her temple as though a headache brewed there. When Matthew reappeared, she offered a tired smile. "He wanted to know if I felt safe here," she explained quietly. "I told him, safer than I have in ages." Matthew's chest tightened at the admission. "Good," he said softly, "because we'll handle anything that comes. You don't have to do this alone." She searched his face, eyes reflecting both regret and relief. Then she nodded and excused herself to the guest bedroom. After seeing the lights click off upstairs, Matthew armed the security system and double-checked every door and window. His phone buzzed with a new notification from the camera feed, but it was only a stray cat slinking across the driveway. He exhaled, tension making his shoulders ache, and realized how deeply he loathed waiting for the next threat to materialize. He trudged into his own bedroom, leaving just a small lamp on the nightstand. Fatigue swept over him. So much had happened in such a short time. He'd become a father, reunited with Stella, taken on a menacing enemy, and now exhaustion crashed in, heavier than any boardroom stress he'd known. He collapsed into bed without undressing, letting his eyes slip shut. Moments later, his phone vibrated again. Heart racing, he grabbed it, but the screen showed only a message from Kelly, his assistant, asking if he needed her to postpone certain meetings. He typed a quick reply, instructing her to handle rescheduling. Then he flicked the phone onto silent and succumbed to restless slumber. Sometime before dawn, he jerked awake, disoriented by a piercing sound. The alarm. Every nerve fired as he shot upright, adrenaline flooding his veins. The house's security system blared, bright lights flicking on downstairs. In seconds, he heard a thump of footsteps in the hallway. Jamie's voice cried, "Dad!" Stella shouted something from the guest room. Matthew bolted, nearly stumbling as he rushed into the corridor. He found Stella at the top of the stairs, hair disheveled, eyes wide with panic. Jamie crouched behind her, face pale. "What's happening?" Stella gasped. Matthew quickly scanned the control panel on the wall. The alarm displayed motion detected near the back door. He sprinted down, heart hammering, and flipped on the outside floodlights. Through the window, he glimpsed a figure darting away toward the shadows of the yard. His mind fired with shock. Norman's people, he couldn't be sure, but the cameras had captured someone. A wave of rage tore through him at the thought that an intruder had tested their defenses. "Stay upstairs!" he yelled, punching the code to silence the alarm. Grabbing a flashlight, he flung open the back door and shone the beam across damp grass. Only the hush of night answered him, the faint rustle of bushes. He took 2 cautious steps out, scanning the perimeter. The new cameras angled down from the roof, their red LEDs winking. He prayed they had recorded a clear face, but whoever it was had vanished into the darkness beyond the fence. Eventually, Matthew retreated inside, locking up again. Stella and Jamie hovered in the living room, eyes full of dread. He forced a grim nod to show them it was clear. "They must have triggered the sensor near the door," he said, trying to keep his voice calm for Jamie's sake. "They didn't get inside." Stella's trembling fingers covered her mouth, tears brimming. "So soon," she whispered. "He's not even waiting." Matthew gritted his teeth. "We'll call the police. They'll review the footage." He moved to the console, pulling up a feed from the newly installed camera. Stella and Jamie stood behind him, peering over his shoulder. The footage was grainy in the low light, but they caught a glimpse of a hooded figure stepping onto the back patio. The person tried the door handle, set off the alarm, then bolted into the yard. Only a partial profile showed, a tall build, possibly male, but no certainty. It was enough evidence, though, to confirm they were under direct surveillance. Jamie exhaled shakily. If the alarm hadn't gone off. Matthew turned, wrapping an arm around the boy. "It did. We're safe." But the words tasted hollow. The barrier between them and Norman felt thinner than ever, each new intrusion a reminder that desperation fueled their pursuers. Shivering, Stella pressed herself to Matthew's side, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, as if blaming herself for every knock of terror. He squeezed her shoulders, voice tight. "No one's hurt. That's what matters now." He could hear how hollow his reassurance sounded, just a placeholder in the face of this brazen invasion. Yet he repeated it for Jamie's sake, too. "We're okay." The rest of that night, none of them slept. They waited on the police, who arrived near dawn to collect the footage and note the forced attempt. The officer recognized the situation from Stella's statement and promised to escalate the case, urging them to keep doors locked and remain prepared. By morning, a hazy gray light filled the windows, highlighting the exhaustion on everyone's faces. If normalcy had ever hovered within reach, it had vanished in a single horrifying moment. The fight against Norman had begun, and Matthew knew he had to be ready, no matter what came next. Please remember to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with friends. After the attempted break-in, a tense hush settled over the house in Westchester. Even with police reassurance and reinforced locks, Stella found herself checking every window with anxious glances while Jamie hovered near Matthew, as though he might vanish if left alone. In the daylight, the yard looked peaceful, but they all knew how thin the barrier was between them and the threats swirling just beyond. Detective Ramos had stepped up efforts to track Norman Ellis, but the man remained elusive. No permanent address, no clear pattern of movement. Each phone call from the detective brought the same half-hopeful news. "We're getting closer, but no arrests yet." Weeks passed in this suspended state of vigilance. The small family tried to build routines. Jamie began studying from home, waiting until it felt safe to enroll him in a local school. Stella accompanied Matthew on errands, scanning each parking lot for suspicious faces. The security cameras never stopped recording. Whenever a shadow flickered near the fence, the alarm beeped, sending their hearts racing. Yet day by day they learned to exist together, forging an odd sense of normalcy. Meals at the kitchen island sometimes featured laughter and inside jokes. Jamie resumed puzzles and reading, occasionally pulling Stella into discussions about the stories he devoured. Matthew found comfort in these fragile domestic moments, glimpsing the family life he never thought he'd have, but the tension remained. At night, Stella often woke from nightmares, creeping downstairs to check the locks. Matthew once found her shivering on the couch, tears glimmering under the dim lamp. She confessed that she feared Norman more than anything, that he'd once claimed he could disappear people if they crossed him. Matthew held her hand, promising to use every resource he possessed to keep her safe. She clung to his words like a lifeline, though he sensed how helpless she still felt. Jamie, for his part, soldiered on with quiet determination, though nightmares stalked him too. Sometimes he woke in a sweat, crying out for his mother or father in the darkness. Their shared anxieties bound them closer, a fragile unit standing against the unknown. One gray morning, while Stella and Jamie were tidying the living room, Matthew received a call from a number he didn't recognize. He answered cautiously, expecting more threats. Instead, a harsh male voice demanded, "I want to speak to Stella Holden. You tell her Norman isn't finished." Adrenaline shot through Matthew's veins. He pressed the phone to his ear, stepping outside to keep Stella from panicking. In a measured tone, he said that if Norman approached again, the authorities would lock him away. A chilling laugh crackled across the line. "Cops don't scare me," Norman replied, "and neither does your money. If she's smart, she'll pay what she owes. Soon." Before Matthew could respond, the call ended, leaving him staring at the silent phone. He reported the call to Detective Ramos, who advised caution but warned they still lacked definitive proof of criminal activity beyond intimidation. The detective needed direct evidence, recorded attempts at extortion, bank statements of the illegal loans, or witness testimony linking Norman to violence. Stella, trembling when Matthew relayed the conversation, felt her terror reawakened. Yet it also sparked a fierce resolve. She rummaged through old bags, searching for any scrap of paper or text thread that might strengthen the case. Late that night, she found partial documentation of her initial loan, including a scribbled note with Norman's signature and an interest rate so predatory that it practically screamed extortion. It wasn't much, but it might help Ramos close the net around him. The days blurred, each overshadowed by the specter of confrontation. Then one afternoon, the phone rang again, this time with news from Ramos. "We've located Norman Ellis. He's been spotted at a rundown motel 2 towns over. We believe he's planning to force Stella's hand soon." Matthew's heart pounded at the detective's words. "We'll send officers to apprehend him," Ramos continued, "but I'd advise you to remain on high alert. If he suspects we're close, he could make a desperate move." Hanging up, Matthew relayed the update to Stella and Jamie, seeing a flicker of both hope and dread in their faces. Perhaps this nightmare would finally end, but not without danger. The family barricaded themselves at home, tension winding tighter with every passing minute. Night fell once more, wrapping the property in a thick cloak of silence broken only by the rustle of wind through the trees. Matthew double-checked the locks, while Stella paced the living room, phone clutched in hand. Jamie hovered near the security monitors, scanning the yard for movement. Hours crawled by. Then, close to midnight, the cameras caught flickers at the fence line, someone approaching. The alarm beeped. Stella's face went ashen. Matthew motioned for Jamie to stay back, retrieved a flashlight, and in a voice tight with anger, urged Stella to call the police. Outside, the floodlights burst into brilliance. A figure lurked near a hedge, and Matthew recognized the silhouette from the grainy images weeks earlier, Tall, broad, hood drawn low, Norman Ellis had come to collect. Clenching his fists, Matthew stepped onto the porch, shouting, "Stay where you are! The police are on their way!" In the glare of the lights, Norman's features twisted into a sneer. "Guess you're the big hero now," he spat. "She owes me, and I'm not leaving without my money." His voice reverberated across the still night. Through the open door, Stella stood trembling, phone pressed to her ear, while Jamie peered around her, eyes wide. Norman took a step closer, reaching into his jacket. Fear jolted Matthew's heart, but he refused to back down. "Don't do anything stupid," he warned. At that moment, sirens wailed in the distance, red and blue lights cutting through the darkness. Norman glanced behind him, face twisting with fury at being cornered. Within seconds, patrol cars screeched to a halt near the driveway. Detective Ramos sprang out, gun drawn, flanked by uniformed officers. "Hands where we can see them," he roared. Norman froze, posture rigid. The tension snapped like a drawn wire. Norman's gaze flicked to Stella, then to Matthew, hatred blazing in his eyes. Slowly, with a sneer, he raised his hands, letting a small revolver clatter to the ground. Officers rushed in, pinning Norman's arms as he cursed and threatened, spouting vile promises of revenge. "You'll regret this," he hissed at Stella, just before they cuffed him. "No matter where you run." But the officer slammed him against the hood of a patrol car, cutting off his tirade. Finally, Norman Ellis was in custody,